The story begins in a city in ruins where an intense battle was underway. Kim Himtae raised his flaming weapon and delivered a powerful strike, causing the ground to heat up instantly. With a shout, he activated his meteoric attack skill, unleashing a shower of flaming fragments. The buildings around began to collapse under the destruction. Faced with the scene, he couldn't believe it was real. Meanwhile, another man blocked his charge and, calling him by name, expressed his disappointment upon realizing that this was the extent of his abilities. He believed Himtae could offer more than that, and upon finding out otherwise, felt a mix of frustration and anger. With a piercing gaze, he prepared to counterattack, activating his own skill. He was determined to crush his opponent. For him, this was the story of a rejected hero. In a not-so-distant past, countless plants and animals on Earth mutated, turning into terrifying monsters. Soon after, invaders from other dimensions arrived, plunging the world into chaos. Cities were devastated, and the weakest could only beg. However, to face this anarchy, humanity formed a guild and created a squad of heroes endowed with abilities. Inside a dungeon, Tauros roared and swung his massive weapon at Hwang Junho, the tank of the Heroes Guild. Blocking the impact with his shield, Hwang Junho showed irritation, wondering how that monster could be so strong. The blow had been intense enough to make him question whether he could really endure it. Yu Jai-han, the guild's support, ran to assist, and intercepting the attack, warned his companions that they needed to act quickly. Understanding the urgency of the situation, a member activated their abilities. Using Scalding Thunder, they launched a sequence of lightning bolts at the monster, trying to weaken it. Lim Sayan, the mage of the Heroes Guild, watched the scene with a smile. She seemed to enjoy the idea of testing the creature's endurance and, sarcastically, hinted that she wanted to see how much it could take. However, when the monster roared again, the creature was still standing, and that was something no one expected. In the midst of the combat, the protagonist realized that Lim Sayan was in danger and managed to save her from an attack. Frightened, she called him by name, revealing the fear she felt. He, in turn, looked at the creature with anger, shocked by the fact that even after a direct hit, it didn't have a single scratch. Even so, that fight had bought them a bit more time. Lee Mia, the guild's main damage dealer, got into attack position and, activating her speed skill, struck the field boss. The monster, enraged, roared and raised its sword, preparing for a destructive counterattack. However, before it could strike, a figure above it raised a finger, and with a devastating blow, summoned a meteor that crashed down on the creature. Displaying confidence, the one who launched the attack seemed to consider the dungeon no real challenge. Meanwhile, the protagonist reflected on the strength of the Heroes Guild, which in his eyes was unbeatable, and held the top spot among all guilds. On the other hand, Kim Himtae, leader of the Heroes Guild, announced that the dungeon boss had been defeated. As he looked at his companions, he realized he was also one of the founders of that team, but little did he know that everything was about to change. After some time surrounded by already defeated enemies, Yu Jai-han received unexpected news. Kim Himtae informed him that they were expelling him from the team. Not understanding, he looked at the leader and questioned the reason for it. Later, walking under the rain, he took the phone out of his pocket and checked his bank account. All the effort dedicated over 7 years had amounted to just 10 million, a value he considered insignificant compared to the hard work he had put in. As he stared at the screen, memories of his former teammates surfaced. Hwang Junho, mocking, questioned whether he had ever done anything useful for the team. Lim Sayan, with a look of superiority, stated that any rookie could perform his role as long as they were well trained. Lee Mia, without showing any hesitation, called him by name and declared that he was just weak. Kim Himtae, in a threatening tone, stated that the team no longer needed him. The protagonist opened his eyes and lifted his face, showing an expression marked by pain. He tried to understand why he had stayed so long in the Heroes Guild. Now in his journey, it was coming to an end. Feeling a mix of anger and frustration, he activated his skill. He would not allow things to end like this. He knew his unique skill activates randomly in special situations. After being expelled, he spent a week looking for a new guild until he found the Fun Guild. A system window appeared before him, displaying unexpected information. According to the data, the chances of the Fun Guild growing and becoming a major organization if Yu Jai-han were to join it were 99%. Thanks to his ability, he realized that this guild had far more potential than the Heroes Guild. Upon arriving at the Fun Guild headquarters, Kim Sai-hu was frustrated to notice a power outage, causing a small accident as she spilled her ramen. At that moment, Yu Jai-han walked through the door, breathing heavily. Seeing him, Kim Sai-hu turned around, surprised, trying to understand who this stranger was. Out of breath, he announced his intention to join the guild. Before he could say anything else, he felt his body give out. His eyes closed and he collapsed to the floor, losing consciousness. Startled by his sudden fall, she approached and asked if he was okay. Sometime later, the protagonist woke up on the couch. Sitting beside him, she watched him closely and asked if he had finally woken up. Kim Sai-hu, the leader of the Fun Guild, showed concern as she called him by name and informed him he had been unconscious for about an hour. Still feeling the impact, he raised his hand to his head and asked how she knew his name. In response, she showed him some documents containing his information, leaving him surprised. Curious, she asked why someone from the renowned Heroes Guild would want to join such a small guild after having having been part of such a grand one. Faced with the question, his expression changed and he lowered his head. Standing up from the couch, he said he could explain everything to her. After hearing him out, Kim Sai-hoo clapped her hands lightly and said she now understood his situation. Leaning on her hands, she commented that with his experience, he could easily join another guild. However, she couldn't understand why he had chosen the Fun Guild in particular. He tried to answer but hesitated, wondering if she would believe him if she knew the truth about his mysterious ability. Noticing his difficulty in talking about it, Kim Sai-hoo decided to share something about herself first. Taking off her headphones, she revealed that she was the daughter of an elf and a human, and thus a half-elf. Surprised by the information, he repeated the question to confirm if she really was a half-elf. He reflected for a moment on the countless invasions from different dimensions and how they led to the emergence of various species in the world, including elves. Kim Sai-hoo continued, mentioning that the blood of elves, who had once exterminated humans, ran in her veins. Faced with the revelation, he formed his own opinion on the matter. She then looked directly at him and asked if, even knowing that he still wished to join the Fun Guild. The two exchanged an intense look. It was at that moment that he noticed something peculiar. Even though she was trying to intimidate him, her hands were visibly trembling. Surprised by his reaction, she watched him closely. Without showing any fear, he stated that he had nothing against elves, as he had seen them before and didn't consider them very different from humans. With a calm smile, he added that only idiots would discriminate against someone based on their species. Kim Sai-hoo covered her mouth with her hand, embarrassed by her attempt to provoke him. After a brief moment of reflection, she said she understood his stance and that she would consider his application to the guild, promising to contact him later. He agreed to that and thanked her. While everything seemed to have been resolved, something unexpected happened. Kim Sai-hoo looked at her staff, noticing with surprise that a strong glow was emanating from it. Suddenly, a bright light emerged from the artifact, transforming into a concentrated sphere of energy. Recognizing the phenomenon, Kim Sai-hoo realized that it was the spirit of Sylph, who had been dormant for 12 years. Watching the sphere of energy approach the protagonist, she questioned herself, intrigued about the reason behind such an event. He in turn was surprised by the spirit's reaction and tried to understand what it meant. Before he could process the situation, a pillar of radiant light surrounded him. Sitting on the floor, Kim Sai-hoo watched the scene in shock, murmuring to herself that this couldn't be happening. The protagonist looked at his own hand, noticing it was now covered in wind energy. Still in disbelief, Kim Sai-hoo came to the conclusion that Sylph had just formed a contract with him. He, on the other hand, realized something even more impressive. The one who had been rejected and expelled from his former guild now possessed a super rare class. After all, in that moment, he had become an elementalist, class that only 20 people in the entire world possessed. Furthermore, some people formed contracts with special creatures, acquiring unique powers and receiving the coveted super rare class of elementalist. In this world, there were only a few elementalists, among them Luca Harrison, the Mist Elementalist, Morosi, the Sea Elementalist, and Abubakar, the Sand Elementalist. They were extraordinary individuals, each possessing power comparable to that of an entire guild. Now, however, another rare elementalist had appeared. The protagonist had become a wind elementalist. After some time, the hero guild, Yu Jae-han, asked if he had made a contract with the spirit. Kim Sai-hoo confirmed, explaining that she had sealed a pact with the spirit of wind, Sylph, who was in fact her deceased mother. Raising his hands anxiously, Yu Jae-han suggested that perhaps it would be possible to break the contract and return the spirit. However, Kim Sai-hoo explained that it was too late for that, as once a spirit chose its owner, the bond could only be broken by the contractor's death. Observing him with some hesitation, she asked why he was questioning that. Yu Jae-han then revealed that he had passed the test, and that, in truth, he just wanted to have fun there. With a smile, she said she understood his intention and that, from that moment on, she would teach him how to control the spirit. However, Kim Sai-hoo declared seriously that he didn't want to waste time training and preferred to test his skills right away. Surprised by his determination, she watched as he conjured a sphere of wind with his ability, declaring that they should head to the monster territory. The monster territory was a special area where creatures ranging from 5th to 1st class would appear. The closer to 1st class, the more dangerous the beasts inhabiting the place became. After some time, they arrived in Bucheon, the zone where 5th class monsters usually appeared. To Kim Sai-hoo, it was the perfect place to measure his strength. Meanwhile, Yu Jae-han, gripping his staff tightly, looked around nervously. Noticing her hesitation, Kim Sai-hoo asked what was wrong. Embarrassed, she looked down and revealed that it was her first time entering the monster territory since she had started training at the Hero Academy. Surprised, he stared at her and asked with a serious expression why she had never mentioned that before. Blushing, she admitted that she was ashamed. After all, she was the guild leader. In response, Kim Sai-hoo stated that he would take the role of leader for that mission. Crossing the barrier and entering the territory, they walked along a ruined street, alert to any threat. Kim Sai-hoo asked if she knew what kind of monsters they might find there. Looking at her phone, Yu Jae-han replied that she needed a moment to check the information. After a few moments, she informed him that the main enemies in the area were cockatrice. Confused, Kim Sai-hoo asked if she meant basilisks, and she confirmed it, citing news about a truck full of chickens that had overturned in the region 2 weeks earlier. Hearing that, he drew his weapon, concluding that the accident must be related to the creatures in the area. After all, chickens are ideal prey to train monsters, turning the place into a battlefield where blood would be spilled and flesh torn apart at any moment. At the time, their team consisted of only 2 members, which meant he would have to act as both tank and attacker. Suddenly, his expression hardened. Immediately, Yahello shouted, alarm, saying she had felt something in the parking lot. Looking in the indicated direction, they spotted a basilisk devouring a human corpse behind a car. Kim Si-hoo instantly recognized the danger. It was a 5th-class monster. Preparing for battle, he called Yahello by name and politely asked her to stay behind him and support him. In response, the monster charged fiercely, extending its claws in her direction, ready to attack. He realized it was getting closer and with a confident smile blocked the monster's strike with his weapon. He knew this was the right moment to act and without hesitation, alerted his companion to begin her attack. She began chanting a spell in an unknown language, her voice filled with power. Once she finished the incantation, she cast her skill Wind Arrow. The projectile cut through the air and struck the creature directly, causing it to roar in pain before falling. He looked at the monster on the ground, holding his weapon firmly. He thought she had done a great job. Catching her breath, she commented that during her time at the Hero Academy, she had been considered the best in her class. However, before they could proceed, more basilisks began to appear, emerging from the shadows and hiding behind cars. Realizing the new threat, she widened her eyes and in shock, warned him that something was about to attack from behind. He reacted quickly, turning just in time and activating his analysis skill. Facing the enemies, he assessed the situation and concluded he needed an effective way to dodge. A system window appeared in front of him, informing him that if he crouched at the right moment, he would have an 82% chance to evade the attack. Without hesitation, he activated his accelerate skill, which allowed him to launch a devastating strike against the monsters, eliminating them before they could react. Meanwhile, his companion watched him, visibly impressed. The surprise on her face was evident, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She wondered how he had managed to master communication with sylphs so quickly, and whether he had really awakened his powers just one day ago. While thinking about it, she began to question what kind of person he really was. Unbothered by her doubts, he sheathed his weapon and picked up the body of the defeated monster. He figured it was a good time to start collecting resources. Seeing this, she ran to him and agreed with his decision. He figured that this training was already enough to test his skills, but suddenly, a bad feeling made him shiver. Danger was approaching. In a quick reflex, he shouted her name, warning that something was behind her. She turned, confused, not understanding what was happening. But then a massive basilisk emerged from the shadows. For a brief moment, she froze in fear and asked hesitantly how the creature had appeared in a 5th-class monster territory. He remained focused and took a defensive stance, reflecting on the situation. He concluded that the creature must belong to an unknown class, much more dangerous than the previous ones. Activating his analysis skill, he watched a new system window appear. The data was clear. The probability of defeating that monster was only 12%. He knew he needed a strategy. He turned to his companion and asked if she could slow the basilisk down. She hesitated, surprised by the request. She looked uncomfortable and apologized, explaining that she could only immobilize the monster for a short time. For him, that would be enough. Without wasting any more time, he charged for the creature. Sensing the threat, the basilisk let out a deafening roar and launched a fierce attack, extending its claws. He knew he had to act at that very moment and shouted for his companion to activate her skill. Quickly, she cast Slow Wind, and the creature was temporarily frozen in place. Taking the opportunity, he leaped up, raising his weapon to deliver a decisive blow. However, the creature grew even more enraged and with immense strength, broke through the magical restraint, freeing itself completely. In one swift, brutal move, it hurled him straight toward its open mouth. As he was thrown, memories from the past flooded his mind. He remembered the former guild leader, who once called him useless, but he was no longer that weak young man. In the next instant, Kim Si-hoo, witnessing everything, used her ability and immobilized the basilisk. Taking the chance, the protagonist gathered all his energy and activated the powerful Wind Slash skill. His blow was devastating, ripping through the creature and ending the battle. In the distance, Doha, the Earth Elementalist, was watching the scene closely. He let out a surprised sigh before murmuring to himself that, after all, there was another elementalist in Korea besides him. After some time in Gyeonggi province within the 2nd-class monster territory, giant worms emerged from the ruins of the city. Hwang Juno, upon spotting them, activated his aggression skill, preparing for the imminent attack. As one of the creatures lunged at him, trying to break through his defense, he realized he wouldn't be able to hold it off for long. He shouted his companion's name, urging her to act quickly. Lim Sayan, without hesitation, activated Chain Lightning. The monsters were struck by a sequence of lightning bolts, receiving fatal damage. Seeing the enemies fall, she gave a smug smile, unable to understand how such small creatures could make so much noise. Hwang Juno, irritated by the imprecision of the attack, sharply called her attention, warning that he had nearly been hit. She, indifferent, made a provocative remark that he should lose weight to move better. Before they could continue the argument, Hwang Juno noticed movement behind her. His eyes locked onto another living creature. Lim Sayan, noticing his expression, turned quickly and called out to Yahello, asking for cover. But upon facing the monster in front of her, she was startled to realize that man was no longer part of her team. In an instant, Kim Himtae appeared, wielding his weapon and slicing the monster in half without any difficulty. Lim Sayan turned to the master of the Kara Guild, surprised by his sudden appearance. Time passed, and Lim Sayan, exhausted, tried to catch her breath. The battle had been tougher than expected. Won Juno, equally tired, commented that the monster was different from usual, perhaps a variant of the species. Lim Sayan, however, didn't see anything unusual in the creature. Himtae, clenching his fists in anger, struck the wall. He questioned why they were acting like those monsters were something extraordinary. His frustration was evident. Before anyone could respond, Li Mia approached. Her body was covered in the blood of the monsters she had fought. The bloodthirsty look in her eyes revealed the intensity of the battle. With a cold tone, she announced that she had cleared the second area. Won Juno turned to her, irritated. He reminded her that she shouldn't act alone, and with a reproachful voice, stated that no one else was there to protect her. Li Mia replied that she understood the situation perfectly. Tension in the group rose when the protagonist's name was mentioned. He was the reason they were all in that situation. Won Juno, furious, denied this possibility, claiming Yu Jae-han wasn't needed there. Meanwhile, the protagonist, focused, delivered precise strikes, tearing apart the monster with his skill. Kim Sai-hoo, watching him, was shocked. She couldn't understand how he had managed to defeat such a gigantic creature alone, and wondered how someone could be that strong. Kim Sai-hoo looked at the mangled corpse, perplexed. Had he really managed to eliminate a monster of that size? With a smile, Yu Jae-han saw it as a true gold mine. Kim Sai-hoo ran to him, calling his name and noticing his injuries. Before she could say anything, he collapsed to the ground, exhausted. She immediately approached, holding him and asking if he was alright. Still catching his breath, he gave a tired smile and joked about needing to farm more since those monsters were rare and valuable. Her expression shifted to fury. She was worried, but he still dared to joke about the situation. In a burst of anger, she punched him in the stomach, scolding him. Looking at the monster remains, Kim Sai-hoo noticed the absurd number of bodies scattered around. She asked if he didn't also think it was strange. He acknowledged it might be hard for the two of them to handle everything alone. At that moment, a man approached. With a casual tone, he suggested they shouldn't refuse help. He greeted them while removing his glasses. His demeanor exuded confidence. Jang Seim introduced himself as a representative of Mongding, a company specializing in monster recycling. Kim Sai-hoo was surprised to hear this, and Yu Jae-han explained that the organization focused on collecting and processing remains of defeated creatures. However, something about the businessman's presence felt off to him. With a relaxed smile, the man scratched his head and explained that his company was new. That's why he had to handle this kind of work himself to ensure the business survived. Then he asked if they'd be willing to let his company handle the processing of the basilisks. Kim Sai-hoo found the idea interesting and agreed. Yu Jae-han, however, kept watching the man with suspicion. Something didn't seem right. The businessman adjusted his gloves and said he would first inspect the monster remains. After a quick check, he expressed surprise at how perfectly the cuts had been made. He concluded that the meat extracted from the bodies would be extremely valuable on the market. Kim Sai-hoo, excited, commented that they might even consider moving to a new office given the profits they'd make. Yu Jae-han saw an opportunity to leave most of the remains with them, but kept one valuable item for himself, a magic crystal, generated only by the death of rare species. With that, he realized he could easily get rich. Suddenly, a wall of stone rose around him. His expression turned to surprise. Kim Sai-hoo, noticing the situation, asked what was happening. Yu Jae-han tried to free himself, screaming and begging to be spared. He claimed he would return the magic crystal if necessary. Doha, cold and harsh, stated that businessmen like that one had the nasty habit of trying to take what wasn't theirs. With overwhelming strength, he grabbed the man and asked how he dared to steal someone else's item. Kim Sai-hoo, watching the scene, was surprised by his strength. Doha, with an ironic smile, held the magic crystal. Yu Jae-han wondered if that was truly the first-class hero Doha. Kim Sai-hoo, stunned, called him by name and asked what guild member was doing there. The protagonist, picking up the crystal from the ground, declared that the item belonged to their guild. Then he asked Doha, ironically, if the first-class hero really intended to rob them. Doha, keeping the same provocative tone, replied that he was just following orders from the association, which mandated the collection of that type of species. Yu Jae-han, clearly dissatisfied, activated his skill, sensing imminent danger. A system window appeared, stating that his chance of victory was 0%. He scratched his head, realizing he had misunderstood the situation in the worst possible way. Suddenly, Doha vanished. Before he could react, the protagonist was caught off guard. Doha appeared behind him, ready to attack. With no room to resist, Doha grabbed his face and, with brutal force, slammed him into the ground. The impact was devastating. With a warning tone, he declared that this was just a demonstration of what could happen if he kept acting that way. The young elementalist, consumed by rage, could only wonder why he had encountered that man there. He was the leader of one of the largest guilds in Korea, Dice, and the only Earth elementalist in the entire world. He was a transcendent hero known as the Earth Dragon. Kim Sai-hoo, outraged, pointed her staff at him, demanding that he step away from Yu Jae-han. Doha, without hesitation, responded that it would be better for her to stay right where she was. He pressed Yu Jae-han Jae-han even harder against the ground, stating that otherwise he would die. Kim Sae-hoo, furious, realized that this man was serious. The protagonist, activating his skill, confidently replied that the only one dying here would be Doha. However, he was wrong. Yoo Jae-han activated the skill Wind Knight, launching Doha far away with a powerful gust of wind. Doha, surprised, questioned how that had happened. Had he really been thrown to the ground? He couldn't believe he'd been tossed like that. It was then that he realized what had truly happened. Summoning the elements, he reduced the impact of the fall, concealing his true power while counterattacking. That boy was interesting. A system window appeared in front of Yoo Jae-han, informing him that if he continued using elemental magic, the probability of death was 95%. He realized he had already spent all his remaining mana on that attack. However, it hadn't been enough to cause real damage to Doha. It was clear that first-class heroes did exist. Yoo Jae-han understood that he was no match for him. Doha, releasing a powerful magic aura, looked down at him as a junior. After exchanging opening blows, he announced that they could move on to the second round. With a confident smile, he asked who would strike first. To his surprise, the protagonist threw a magic crystal into his hands. Raising his hands, he declared his surrender. Doha was furious. How could he just surrender now? Yoo Jae-han asked what his real objective was. If all he wanted was the magic crystal, there was no need to continue fighting. Doha hesitated. If he accepted the surrender, he would have to obey the surrender declaration as stated in paragraph 9, Article 38 of the Hero Act. Annoyed, he mumbled that he was just looking to have some fun. He turned to the side but then noticed something. The association members had arrived. Kim Sae-hoo looked up and recognized the Hero Association's helicopter. A woman shouted from the helicopter, reproaching Doha. She wanted to know why he had come there alone. Doha, unfazed, held up the magic crystal and stated that his mission was already complete. Therefore, there was no need for scolding. Soon after, the team disembarked. Doha smiled and suggested they settle the outcome of the fight later. Curious, he asked for the protagonist's name. Yoo Jae-han introduced himself formally as a member of the Guild Fun. Doha repeated the name of the guild, intrigued. Then he made an unexpected offer. He said he would personally recommend them for the 4th class promotion test. Yoo Jae-han was surprised. Why would he do that? Doha simply replied that he wanted to make sure the helicopter took off soon. He asked Kim Sae-hoo if she had heard what he said. He told her to handle the recommendation letter. He then reminded them that the test was in 2 days. How would they get a recommendation so quickly? Besides, their guild wasn't even officially registered. Kim Sae-hoo, looking at Yoo Jae-han, noticed something strange. He was injured. How was that possible? Yoo Jae-han smiled. He said he was going to have a lot of fun with this. Sometime later, back at the guild, one of the members knelt down guilt-ridden. He admitted he was wrong. Yoo Jae-han, furious, clenched his fists. He said it was time to stop apologizing and just prepare for the scolding. The man, scared, asked to be heard first. With a nervous smile, he explained that he had overheard their conversation. He knew they were going to take the 4th class promotion test. However, the test was in 2 days. That meant they needed to upgrade their gear immediately. He asked if they had considered that. He mentioned that their weapons looked worn out and their gear was at its limit. Entering the test like that would be a disaster. Beating his chest with confidence, he suggested they go to a workshop he knew. There, they could resolve that issue. After that, Yoo Jae-han could beat him up all he wanted. The group exchanged glances. Eventually, they decided to follow him. After some time, they arrived at the workshop. Upon entering, the protagonist examined the place carefully. Yoo Jae-han noticed something strange. The place was empty. Kim Sae-hoo, suspicious, asked if this was another one of his tricks. Jang Se-eun laughed nervously and assured them it wasn't. At that moment, a voice echoed through the workshop. The dwarf asked who they were. With a firm grip on his hammer, he looked at the group with a stern expression. He warned them that it was the team's day off. Then, irritated, asked why they had shown up there. He believed himself to be a dwarven blacksmith. After all, everyone knew that dwarves were a race of first-class blacksmiths, renowned for crafting weapons of exceptional quality. It was no surprise that any hero would want to meet them. The young woman watched him with excitement, thrilled to finally see a dwarf up close. To her, the weapons crafted by his race were legendary, boasting S-rank quality. The protagonist shared her excitement as she smiled with satisfaction. Turning to him, she commented that he didn't seem so bad, not even for the respective director of Montagne. She couldn't believe they had been brought to a workshop run by a dwarf. However, upon looking again in his direction, she was surprised to see that he had disappeared. Doubt crept into her mind. Where had he gone? Then, a laugh echoed through the room. The voice carried amusement, but also a touch of irony. He knew they were all mistaken. Though they believed they were facing a dwarf, they were wrong. With a smile on his face, he claimed to be just a human, born in Korea. The revelation left her in disbelief. Her expression quickly changed, showing how difficult it was to process that information. To her, there was no doubt. He was a dwarf. Her voice rose into a shout full of frustration as she accused him of trying to deceive them. Another member of the group, equally skeptical, pointed at him, demanding he show his ID. He simply laughed, though his gaze remained serious. Without hesitation, he took out his documents and handed them over for verification. With a firm expression, he stated they could check for themselves. The documents were examined carefully. The young woman was shocked to realize that they were indeed authentic human records. Yu Jia-han, still puzzled, asked to see them too. His eyes scanned the papers as an expression of surprise appeared on his face. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. What caught his attention the most was the recorded age, 27 years old. However, the photo didn't resemble the supposed dwarf at all. Doubt immediately arose. How was that possible? Could the identity have been stolen? His mind buzzed with questions as he cast a suspicious glance at the man. The idea of reporting the case to the police was brought up indignantly. Frustration overtook the young woman, who held her head in irritation. She felt deceived and began to suspect they had once again been tricked by the Munton Company. While the tension grew, he remained calm. In a polite manner, or at least trying to sound that way, he suggested they call the police. However, his gaze soon shifted to something that caught his attention. His eyes landed on the weapon, analyzing it closely. A question formed in his mind: was that really what he thought it was? He felt the urge to examine it more carefully and without hesitation made the request. As he held it, his expression changed slightly. A specific detail in the markings engraved on the blade caught his attention. After a brief pause, he concluded that it belonged to a wind elementalist. His observation was met with surprise by the weapon's owner, who immediately asked how he had figured that out. Without breaking eye contact, the blacksmith explained that a first-class professional could recognize the weapon's owner just by the marks left on it. Unfortunately, he concluded that it wouldn't be able to withstand the power of the elements. Determined to find a solution, he began searching his workshop. He needed time, as he had the perfect weapon for elementalists. After a few minutes of searching, he found what he was looking for. With confidence, he handed over the new weapon, stating that it was made to harmonize with the elements. The artifact's name was Nam Ho Yi. Upon hearing the name, the young woman stared at him with a melancholic expression. Doubt crept in. Had he named the weapon after himself? Days later, at the long-awaited promotion exam, the hall was filled with heroes seeking class advancement. The atmosphere was thick with the anxiety of the participants. Kim Se-hyu felt a tightness in her chest as she looked at the crowd around her. The nervousness was clear on her face. Yu Jia-han, for his part, recalled his own fourth-class test, which had taken place a long time ago, back when he was still a member of the Heroes Guild. At that time, just like now, the hall was full of anxious candidates. The activity in the room was interrupted by laughter. One of the heroes present commented mockingly that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He recognized one of the candidates. It was hard to imagine that the guy who had been expelled from the Heroes Guild had the nerve to show up at an exam like this. Another warrior wearing a hood laughed along. With sarcasm, he said that if he were in his place, he'd be too ashamed to keep calling himself a hero. The young woman observing the scene leaned closer to Yu Jia-han and whispered in his ear. Her voice carried a tone of uncertainty. She asked if those comments were about him. Without showing concern, he replied that this kind of thing was normal. When people were in groups, they had a tendency to judge others. However, he felt somewhat relieved to realize that, at least, there were no rumors about what had really happened in Bucheon. Hiding the fact that he was an elementalist was essential, as any unnecessary exposure would bring problems. Amid the commotion, Bang Yoon-sik raised his voice, ordering everyone to be quiet. His harsh tone showed his impatience with the excessive noise over something as trivial as a promotion exam. To him, those people were just regular individuals, weak and incapable of handling even medium-level challenges. The fourth-class examiner, Eunuch, analyzed the candidates before making a single comment. His tone was cold and blunt. In his view, those candidates were low tier. Meanwhile, the protagonist activated his skill, determined to move forward. In the midst of the preparation, a doubt arose among the examiners. Had Doha really written a recommendation letter for him? The idea seemed absurd. The very possibility made him hesitate as well. But before he could process the situation further, a system notification appeared before his eyes. The message was clear and direct. Chance of passing the test: 1%. After some time, the secretary approached Doha, informing him that she had sent a letter of recommendation for his promotion to 4th class, the same one he had mentioned. Doha, surprised, asked if she had really done that. She confirmed that she had, but found it odd that he, of all people, had been chosen as the examiner. Later, at the location of the 4th class exam, the heroes began devising strategies to attack the examiner. Bang Yoon-sik explained that the first step was to carefully study the opponent before taking action. However, some chose to attack right at the beginning of the battle, which proved to be a reckless mistake. With ease, he neutralized all the attacks, making it clear that his opponents were just fools trying to surpass him without a solid plan. Soon after, the system sounded, announcing that the 12th team had failed the test. Kim Han-seok expressed concern, asking if Bang Yoon-sik hadn't gone overboard. Oh Hae-in, meanwhile, doubted anyone could actually pass the exam. Seo Jung-woo, a 4th class examiner, said that 5th class participants always made the same mistakes. Oh Hae-in, another examiner, harshly asked how she was supposed to report the situation to her superiors. Seo Jung-woo then announced that the last team to appear would be the Fun Guild. He analyzed them and concluded they were the next candidates, as they had received a special recommendation from the leader of the Dice Guild, making the test even more challenging. Meanwhile, The protagonist watched the examination hall closely, its gaze fixed on someone who had just entered. Reflecting on the situation, he concluded that the person didn't seem very flexible. In fact, it was the team leader from the Dice Guild, the one responsible for conducting the 4th class promotion test. The system sounded again, welcoming the participants and explaining the test rules. Over the next 5 minutes, the candidates would have to fight the examiner. To pass, they had to either completely defeat him or earn his confirmation that they had met the necessary requirements. One of the participants, outraged, exclaimed that it was impossible for a 5th class team to defeat an examiner. The protagonist reflected on the challenge's difficulty. He knew that the examiner had fought many teams and hadn't suffered even a scratch. Turning to his companion, he asked her to help him attack from behind, just like they had done in the monster territory. She understood his plan and agreed to follow it. Aware of the battle's difficulty, he activated his skill and prepared for combat. The system's sound echoed through the area, announcing the official start of the 4th class exam. Without delay, the examiner launched a direct attack on the protagonist, attempting to kick his weapon away. However, he held firm and analyzed the situation. An attack right at the start of the test signaled that the opponent wouldn't underestimate anyone. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shook the environment. The protagonist's companion shouted his name, worried. The examiner tried to strike her, but was surprised to see the protagonist shielding her with his wind ability. The young man felt satisfied for managing to block the attack and reassured himself that the letter of recommendation wasn't fake. However, the examiner broke through his defense and delivered a powerful kick to her. Seizing the opportunity, he immediately charged toward the protagonist. The battle grew increasingly intense. He realized how difficult it was. He hadn't imagined a wooden weapon could cause so much damage. He knew he needed to keep some distance to reorganize his strategy. Without hesitation, he activated his Wind Knight skill, creating a gust of wind that launched his opponent far away. The move was executed with precision, and he didn't lose his balance. The examiner, irritated, acknowledged that it was wind magic and commented on how annoyingly talented it was. Determined to counterattack, he activated the accelerate skill and struck from behind. At that moment, Jakey Young questioned the examiner's decision. If he had indeed written a letter of recommendation, wouldn't that become a problem for them? The Fun Guild was struggling, and the presence of that candidate made everything more complicated. Doha, however, laughed and explained that he had done it because that young man was one of a kind, a swordsman capable of slicing through the wind. Back at the exam site, Eunuch activated his skill, Line and Slash, delivering a quick blow against the protagonist. This time, however, his speed seemed slower than before. The young man still felt the effects of previous battles against the Basilisk and noticed that his weapon consumed an absurd amount of mana. The examiner, with an arrogant look, asked if he had received the recommendation letter solely because of that skill. If that were the case, he would destroy him right then and there without mercy. Kim Sai-Hu, sensing the danger, activated her skill and yelled for him to leave the protagonist alone. But the examiner easily dodged the attack and hesitated for a moment before saying something. Kim Sai-Hu took the chance to intervene and insisted that he let her handle it. She knew she couldn't hide behind the protagonist forever. She had to act. The examiner, however, rudely asked why she didn't just back off. She in turn refused to give in, calling him stupid and proudly revealing her identity. Showing off her pointed ears, she declared herself the leader of the Fun Guild. The examiner, surprised, smiled. So she was an elf after all. Unlike an ordinary mage, she dared to face him directly. He activated his skill and rudely stated that he expected her to try something. The elf, however, trusted in her abilities. She knew that elves could give the flow of mana, and because of that, she managed to dodge the attacks effortlessly. Activating the wind arrow skill, she fired straight at the examiner. He blocked the attack with his weapon and mocked her. He found it ridiculous to think such a simple move could work on him. However, at that moment, he felt something strange behind him. Turning around, he saw another magic being activated. In an instant, he was surrounded by a complex seven-sided spell, something he never would have expected from a 5th class candidate. The young woman activated her slow wind skill, immobilizing him. The spell struck its target head-on, covering him in a thick magical mist. She was convinced she had landed a hit. Even for an examiner, there was no way he could come out of that unscathed. However, to her shock, he reappeared behind her, placing his weapon at her neck. With a calm smile, he admitted that her plan to corner him was good, but unfortunately, far too slow. The protagonist, seeing the situation, prepared to strike. She looked at him, surprised. With a burst of mana, he declared that the examiner would lose due to his own arrogance. He knew his weapon could no longer absorb any more mana, and he had already used nearly all of his reserves. Still, he was determined to concentrate everything he had left into a single powerful strike. Sometime later, at the Keros Guild, Park Jung-seub was looking out the window. His secretary held a set of documents and announced that it was the daily status report from Kim Hyuntae's team. Curious, he asked whether the new member Kim Kang-woo was adapting quickly. He explained that this was the young man he had sent to Kim Hyuntae's team after Yoo Jae-han was eliminated. The test reports indicated that he was still in the adaptation phase and showing some instability. However, Park Jung-seub believed that team leader Kim Hyuntae would be able to stabilize him, as the new team member was far more useful than Yoo Jae-han. One of the staff members nervously reported that some information had surfaced about the one who had been expelled from the team. The Keros Guild leader, intrigued, asked what it was about, The staff reported that they had discovered Yu Jae-han had passed the class promotion test. The guild leader was shocked by the news, barely able to contain his mana. On the promotion test field, a broken wooden sword lay on the ground. The protagonist had the blade of his weapon positioned against the examiner's neck. Watching the scene, he laughed himself as he tried to understand how Yu Jae-han had managed to get a recommendation from Doha. With a sigh, the examiner admitted defeat and declared that he was giving up. To him, sending an elementalist to the exam was practically cheating. Later, Yu Jae-han and Kim Sai-hoo were sitting on a sofa in the hallway, recovering from the battle. With a tired sigh, Yu Jae-han remarked that he hadn't expected to survive that test. Kim Sai-hoo, cheerful, called him by name and asked who he really was. She wanted to know how he had learned to use elemental magic so quickly. After all, with each battle, he seemed to demonstrate a new move. Exhausted, he replied that he didn't know how to explain it. Reflecting on the battle, he realized he had grown even closer to elemental magic during the fight. Perhaps that had been his plan all along. With a smile, the protagonist praised Kim Sai-hoo, calling her by name and highlighting that she had done an excellent job as well. Thanks to her, they had won. She had distracted the enemy at just the right moment. Kim Sai-hoo's shy insisted that she hadn't done anything extraordinary. He, however, emphasized that somehow they had managed to win the exam battle. Despite that, they still had to face the final interview. Suddenly, the doors opened and other heroes entered the hallway. A voice announced that the next candidates could come in. The Fun Guild team was politely called into the interview room. Shortly after, they were in the interview room. The female examiner commented that the previous team had been very well prepared for the test. Another examiner added that their battle had also been interesting. Yu Jae-han and his team listened silently, waiting patiently for them to finish speaking. Then the examiner stated that if there were no objections, they would be promoted. That's when Lee Dong-ho, a member of the Warriors Guild, spoke up. With disdain, he expressed his opposition, claiming that those candidates should be disqualified. He justified his stance by saying that the team's tank was too hesitant and would panic in a real combat situation if the team were attacked. Gripping the document tightly, he questioned how that team could possibly be applying for 4th class. To him, it was simply absurd. One of the staff members commented that their guild had failed its promotion attempt when they had tried. The examiner laughed and said that in that case, no one would truly understand the situation. Yu Jae-han noticed that everyone was speaking as if they wanted them to hear those criticisms loud and clear. Soon after, the examiner announced that the next interviewees could be seated. Kim Sai-hoo, excited, greeted everyone and introduced the team as the Fun Guild. The examiner reviewed the documents and, surprised, asked if they had really been the only team to pass the battle test. He found that quite surprising. The protagonist, smiling, replied that they were flattered, but in the end, it had all been a matter of luck. Kim Sai-hoo, with a subtle change in expression, politely thanked the examiner for his kind words. Then the examiner asked whether, since they had managed to face the exam's examiner, the interview might be unnecessary. Dong-ho, however, looked at Kim Sai-hoo with disdain. His gaze fixed on her ears, thinking her hairstyle was dull. Then Kim Sai-hoo brushed her hair aside, revealing her pointed ears. With that, she confidently announced her identity. Dong-ho, surprised, let out a sigh. So that was it. She was a half-elf. With a malicious grin, he licked his lips and murmured that he had hoped she was a pure-blooded elf. The male examiner called his attention, warning him to be more careful with his words. Forcing a smile, Lee Dong-ho replied that he was merely apologizing, claiming that his reaction was an automatic habit, something he didn't even fully understand himself. Then he turned to Yu Jae-han, telling him to relax. Yu Jae-han, however, looked at him with clear effort to contain himself. Everything about Lee Dong-ho was repulsive to him. Before he could react impulsively, he felt Kim Sai-hoo's hand grasp his. In a calm tone, she called his name, assuring him she was fine and asking him to stay calm. He let out a long sigh, trying to suppress his anger. Lee Dong-ho, satisfied with the reaction he had provoked, laughed nonchalantly and suggested they continue the interview. Yu Jae-han, still tense, decided he wouldn't give in to the provocation. The examiner resumed reviewing the documents he held in his hands. While reading, he asked Kim Sai-hoo about her father, Kim Bo, who worked at the Monster Research Institute in Kyoto. He confirmed the information and mentioned a recent achievement: the capture of a mutant basilisk in the monster territory. The answer made Yu Jae-han smile. To him, it was a source of pride. The examiner, surprised by the confirmation, exchanged glances with his colleague, acknowledging that for a newly formed guild with only 2 members, such an achievement was impressive. If they kept up this pace, they could gain significant recognition. That's when Lee Dong-ho interrupted the conversation. With a tone of apparent disinterest, he remarked that he found it curious the guild was led by a half-elf. He stated that in all of his years as a hero, he had never seen anything like it. Soon after, his expression turned more inquisitive. With an ambiguous smile, he asked a direct question. If South Korea were attacked by elves, which side would you be on? The atmosphere in the room instantly grew heavy. Kim Sai-hoo hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with the question. Her gaze faltered for a moment before she quietly murmured that she preferred not to talk about it. The blade skill, he launched into the final attack. Lee Dong-ho, visibly dissatisfied, insisted, questioning the reason for her refusal to answer. Before she could say anything, Yu Jae-han intervened firmly, asking if that was the kind of training the Warriors Guild offered its members. For a moment, the rune fell silent. Kim Sae-hyo looked at Yoo Jae-han, surprised by his attitude, while Lee Dong-ho stared at him with evident irritation. Yoo Jae-han continued, his voice filled with disdain. He made it clear that, until that moment, he hadn't even cared about the promotion, but seeing the guild being humiliated like that deeply infuriated him. He slammed his fist on the table, stating that the final decision was his alone. The examiners exchanged uncertain looks, trying to intervene. One of them asked both of them to calm down. But Yoo Jae-han, consumed by frustration, declared that he would rather refuse the promotion. The comment provoked an immediate reaction. Lee Dong-ho, incredulous, shouted, calling him an idiot and questioning how he dared to say such a thing. The situation spiraled out of control. The examiner, impatient, ordered both of them to stop. His tone was now much harsher. He asked if they had really come to the interview just to start a confrontation. Kim Sae-hyo tried to intervene, but her hesitation kept her from acting with resolve. Inside, she knew things had taken a disastrous turn. Later in the Fun Guild office, Kim Sae-hyo sat silently, holding a cup of tea between her hands. Yoo Jae-han, beside her, scratched the back of his head, uncomfortable. With a sigh, he apologized. He knew his impulsiveness had sabotaged the promotion. Kim Sae-hyo, however, smiled softly. She assured him that it was okay. Despite the outcome, she confessed that, in a way, she felt grateful. It had been the first time in her life that someone had defended her like that. Yoo Jae-han watched her in silence. The tone of her voice, the way she looked away, there was a mixture of emotions in her words. Even so, something caught his attention. Kim Sae-hyo kept pressing the refresh button on the computer screen. Not understanding, he asked why she was doing that. She averted her eyes, a little embarrassed, and replied that she just wanted to see who had passed. The monitor finally began loading the results. The phrase, "loading the list of those approved, please wait," appeared on the screen. Yoo Jae-han felt a tightness in his chest. He knew it was his fault. Before he could say anything, Kim Sae-hyo's eyes widened. The loading had finished. She held her breath, reading the list carefully. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the examiner turned to Lee Dong-ho, asking what he was thinking. Lee Dong-ho spun the apple in his hand before giving an ironic smile. He said he really should apologize for what he had done earlier. He acknowledged that maybe he had gone a bit too far. However, his expression quickly changed. His eyes gleamed with dangerous determination. He stated that he was curious to see how far the Fun Guild could go. But inside, his mind boiled with resentment. To him, they were nothing but arrogant fools. He would let them climb as high as they wanted, because once they got there, he would destroy them. Back in the Fun Guild office, silence dominated the room. Yoo Jae-han's eyes were fixed on the computer screen. The highlighted sentence confirmed the unexpected. Approved for 4th class. Fun Guild. Sometime later, in the 2nd-class monster territory, the Karos Guild bus was greeted by a crowd of people and reporters. As Kim Himtae and his guildmates stepped off the vehicle, fans began shouting, calling them Team Hyen and begging them to look their way. The excitement was so intense that a guard had to intervene, ordering everyone to stop pushing and move back. Kim Himtae, smiling, took the guard's hand and asked why he was being so rude. He then thanked the crowd for their support, but warned them they could get hurt, kindly asking them to watch from a distance. A fan among the spectators shouted excitedly, praising his looks and wishing the team good luck. As they walked past the barrier, Kim Hemtae grumbled, annoyed by the excessive noise. Hwang Juno commented that there were even more people than the day before and wondered how so many always showed up. At that moment, Kim Kang-woo, one of the guild members, turned to the team leader and, laughing, pointed to a woman at the entrance, saying she was so ugly he nearly threw up. Still smirking, Kim Kang-woo asked what kind of woman was his leader's type. Kim Hemtae replied, also smiling, that he liked pretty girls. Kim Kang-woo then suggested they go clubbing over the weekend. Lim Sayan, irritated, interrupted harshly, reminding him that she and Lee Mia were still there and asking him to stop talking like that in front of them. Kim Kang-woo, keeping his teasing tone, asked why they didn't just come along. Lim Sayan, surprised, asked why she should do that. With a mischievous grin, Kim Kang-woo said there would be plenty of male models interested in seeing her. Lim Sayan blushed and snapped back, confused, trying to understand what he was implying. Kim Kang-woo thought she'd be easy to persuade, but he had no idea what Lee Mia was thinking. Lee Mia stared straight at him and asked if he wanted something. Kim Kang-woo turned and replied he didn't want anything from her, but thought he should get to know her better before saying anything. Meanwhile, Kim Himtae sensed someone's presence and, turning around, saw a man with a scar on his face who greeted him. The stranger remarked that it had been a long time since they last met in the monster territory and asked how long it had been. Kim Himtae replied that it had been a few months. The man looked over the group and, surprised, asked where one of the former members was. Seeing the confusion, he specified that he meant the one who used to carry the team's equipment. Kim Himtae explained that he had left the team and a rookie had recently joined in his place. Kim Kang-woo bowed politely, introduced himself, and said he now handled support duties. The man with the scar showed disappointment and asked if that was true, lamenting the former member's departure. Kim Himtae, irritated, asked why he was so upset. The man explained that about a year ago, that former teammate had done a huge favor for the team. Even after all that time, he still remembered how amazing his movements were, especially when hauling heavy bags. He then asked if he could get his contact in case the guy hadn't joined another guild yet. They'd gladly take him in. Regardless, he wished the team good luck. Kim Himtae reacted with surprise, asking if he really thought Yu Jae-han was amazing. Kim Kang-woo laughed and commented that from what he'd heard, Yu Jae-han had always been a burden to the group, suggesting they might be overestimating his abilities. In a rough tone, he provoked Kim Himtae to hand over his weapon. Kim Himtae, surprised, asked why he needed it all of a sudden, but before he could get a response, a monster appeared, opening its mouth. Kim Himtae extended his hand, demanding the weapon, and shortly after, slashed the creature with his flaming blade. Meanwhile, his thoughts boiled with anger as he remembered someone. Elsewhere in the city, a woman, distressed, asked what was going on. Panicked, she ran out without grabbing her phone or wallet. A staff member, observing the situation, calmly explained that a fourth-class monster had appeared and asked everyone to evacuate quickly. A man getting dressed in a hurry complained that housing prices in the area would surely drop. Another man, holding a child in his arms, commented that many people would lose their homes. A third person, watching the chaos, said it didn't matter at that moment and asked if that was the right place. Yu Jae-han replied that it probably was. He explained they were in the territory of fourth-class monsters, specifically saber-toothed cats. The protagonist turned after sensing something and warned that it was time to prepare. Kim Sae-hyo activated her ability, shooting 2 magic arrows at one of the monsters and dealing critical damage. The protagonist dashed forward and struck the creature, finishing it off. She sighed in relief, commenting that she thought it was too early to face fourth-class monsters. However, the battle had been much easier than expected. After all, the basilisk they fought before was completely different. She wondered how they'd transport the saber-toothed cat corpses to the first floor. Yu Jae-han looked thoughtfully at the monsters and said they needed to call the monster recycling company. Es screamed, asking for help. She followed and realized someone still hadn't evacuated. He said they needed to hurry to save him. For some reason, that voice sounded familiar. The protagonist shouted that they were members of the Fun Guild and asked if the man was alright. The man, sobbing, begged to be rescued quickly. As they approached, they looked shocked to recognize an old acquaintance. After a moment, the man smiled and expressed his joy at seeing them again. He remarked that, after all, they'd met again in the same place. She, suspicious, thought maybe it was just fate and annoyed, asked if he didn't think the same. Jang Seum suddenly collapsed, holding his stomach, and shouted that he was in intense pain. Yu Jae-han smiled and asked if maybe they should call it a day, since they got a good weapon thanks to him. She, furious, screamed that he was too kind. Yu Jae-han, ignoring her anger, asked Jang Seum if he'd like to sign a contract with them to process monsters. Jang Seum, surprised, apologized and asked if he was serious. The protagonist smiled and said that despite the rough start, he saw potential in him. He said he was grateful for the opportunity and that from now on, he'd work with them. Jang Seum ran into the building and shouted they could leave the monster corpses there for him to handle. Kim Sae-hyo, suspicious, asked and discussed what they'd do if he tricked them again. Yu Jae-han said it wasn't a problem. They still needed someone like him. Even with the basilisk, he made sure to collect the right fang. Looking around, Yu Jae-han said they needed to clarify something right away. Suddenly, a man holding a microphone shouted that the heroes should stop hunting innocent creatures. He repeatedly insisted that monster lives should be respected. Kim Sae-hyo asked if those people were serious. The protagonist explained they belonged to the IUPC. He knew that stood for the International Union for the Protection of Creatures, also known as IUPC. This organization claimed that monsters could coexist peacefully with humans, just like ordinary plants and animals. However, their recent protests had caused many problems near the monster territory. A woman called Yu Jae-han by name and asked if he agreed with those opinions. He responded that he absolutely did not and thought it was all absurd. He wondered how they would react if they saw monsters killing people right in front of their eyes. An officer wearing a hazmat suit politely asked everyone not to approach the area. A man holding a baton questioned why they weren't allowed to enter. One of the activists shouted that they needed to stay united to protect the precious children. Suddenly, the group began pushing and forcing others into the area. After all, there were heroes inside, and according to them, they should be allowed to escape. Yu Jae-han and Kim Sae-hyo found themselves surrounded by a crowd. The protagonist asked if this was some kind of joke. A woman with purple hair screamed in horror and begged to be allowed to see. She sobbed while stroking the corpse of a monster. Crying, she asked how they could commit such an atrocity. A man with black hair was also crying, humming the creature's body. He declared on behalf of all humanity that he apologized to her. The woman with purple hair asked how they could still call themselves heroes after what they had done. The man with black hair, furious, rudely demanded whether they were really heroes or just murderers. Yu Jae-han felt his patience wearing thin. After all, heroes weren't allowed to lay hands on ordinary civilians. He knew he had to make a decision. Should they hold out until the Hero Association sent reinforcements, or should they take a different course of action? Before he could respond, a familiar voice echoed through the crowd. The individual demanded they get out of the way. The protagonist was surprised to recognize the voice. Suddenly, the person releases mana, making his intent clear. The man with black hair shouted furiously, using harsh words to ask who he was. Doha, approaching, sarcastically asked if he really didn't know. With a gesture, He used magic to raise a wall behind him. Then he firmly declared that he was the one they hated the most. With a smile, Doha welcomed them. The protagonist, irritated, immediately recognized the Earth Elementalist, known by the nickname Earth Dragon. It was a name feared by some, a joke to others. In the West, he was also called Earthquake. As he planted his foot on the ground, Doha sank slightly into the soil, adjusting his glasses with his middle finger. Then, with an amused smile, he declared that the nickname he liked most was Scoundrel. The crowd was taken by surprise. One of the protesters exclaimed Doha's name in shock, while another, an ally, questioned why a first-rate hero was there. The protagonist couldn't hide his frustration. It seemed that man only showed up to cause trouble, as if he had nothing better to do. Ignoring the murmurs around him, Doha turned to the protesters and, without hesitation, ordered them to return to hell. At that moment, a colossal figure emerged beside him, a massive stone elemental, who opened its mouth menacingly. Yu Jai-Han felt his muscles tense. The sight of the creature stirred unease. That was Doha's elemental. Without delay, the spirit obeyed its master's command. Beams of energy shot from its mouth, speeding toward the protesters. Terrified, they tried to flee, but the energy clung to their bodies like living roots, lifting them into the air without harming them. Cries of outrage soon followed. The protesters demanded to be released, questioning whether that was how a national hero should treat civilians. Kim Sai-Hu, stunned by the scene, raised his hands to his head, unable to believe what he was seeing. The protagonist, on the other hand, analyzed the situation closely. He noticed that despite the apparent brutality, Doha had managed to restrain everyone without hurting them. His control was so precise it bordered on unbelievable. After confirming that the protesters were no longer a threat, Doha turned to the group of heroes, apologizing for the delay. His expression remained relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened. The heroes exchanged glances, surprised by his unexpected presence. With his hands in the pockets of his shorts, he approached and mentioned he'd heard about their promotion exam to 4th class. Yu Jai-Han was surprised by the comment, recalling the recent fight against a monster. Without hesitation, Doha credited their success to the examiner he had chosen for them. The laughter that followed revealed amusement, but also carried a hint of irony. He seemed to find this situation fascinating. His unpredictable temperament made it hard to grasp his true intentions. The protagonist, however, vividly remembered the danger he had faced. He had almost lost his life during that exam. Doha then looked over the group and commented that Yu Jai-Han had gotten stronger. Next, he expressed curiosity about which of them was stronger now. Suspicion grew on the protagonist's face. He wondered if Doha had come all that way just to say that. Before he could go deeper into the matter, other guild members approached, intrigue. Doha's name echoed among surprised whispers. Many didn't understand his presence in a 4th-class territory and questioned his connection to that team. Kim Sai-Hu, noticing the commotion around them, turned to Yu Jai-Han, clearly concerned about how many people were watching. Doha, meanwhile, expressed his annoyance at the excessive attention. It was better for them to change locations. Soon after, the group headed to a closed-off construction site. Workers continued their tasks, unaware of their presence. One of the workers noticed Doha and approached, greeting him casually before asking if he shouldn't be working. Doha replied with a carefree smile, waving his hand. He claimed he was too tired for that. Yu Jai-Han, observing the interaction, looked around and reflected on the place. Was this the headquarters of the Dice Guild? The number of people present suggested it was. Doha then clarified they were expanding the underground training center. Though the noise was bothersome, he asked the group to be patient. The protagonist nodded, understanding the situation. After a few minutes, they entered a tall building protected by a magical barrier. As soon as they crossed the entrance, Yu Jai-Han felt something odd. The noise from the construction site vanished completely. It felt like being in a quiet cafe without customers. Kim Sai-Hu, impressed by what he saw, looked around in awe. To him, it was incredible that such a large structure could be completely enclosed by a magical barrier. The investment required for such a feat must have been outrageous. He concluded the guild must have taken a loan to fund such infrastructure. After all, as one of the largest organizations, they didn't hesitate to spend money on their headquarters. Yu Jai-Han, still curious, asked whether that truly required so many resources. He pointed to the barrier and confirmed without hesitation. She briefly analyzed it and made an estimate. At least 20 billion had been spent on the installation. The revelation left the protagonist stunned. It was an absurd amount. He wondered if the guild really had the resources to spend like that. At that moment, a figure approached the group. It was Park Jae-hyung, vice leader of the Dice Guild. Adjusting her glasses, she smiled and thanked them for their interest in the magical barrier. She then commented that they had nearly guessed the exact value. Yu Jai-Han, surprised, recognized her. Kim Sai-Hu, beside him, seemed to have misunderstood, thinking Park Jae-hyung was just an ordinary secretary. Doha then walked over to her and greeted her familiarly. He took the opportunity to remind her of the fun guild they had met earlier and asked her to prepare everything for the meeting. Doha asked Park Jae-hyung to get everything ready immediately. She promptly replied that she would, but then grabbed his cheek indignantly. Her voice carried a tone of reprimand as she asked him where he had been that day, completely ignoring the schedule. Doha shouted in pain, surprised by her reaction, and exclaimed in disbelief. He asked how she dared treat the guild master that way. Park Jae-hyung, without hesitation, firmly replied that if he really was the guild master, then you should act like it. Watching the chaotic scene, the protagonist couldn't help but think that, whether inside or outside the building, the environment remained noisy. After a while, everyone settled into the office. Doha grabbed a glass of drink for himself and, without beating around the bush, asked the group what they thought had brought them there. The protagonist analyzed the question and wondered if the reason had to do with Doha's elemental. The Earth Elementalist took a small sip of his drink before confirming with a slight smile that the guess was correct. At that moment, a bright light appeared on the table. The protagonist looked in surprise at the source of the glow, only to see Mumu, Doha's small elemental dog, emerge from it. Doha stroked his partner and encouraged the others to say hello. He introduced him formally, emphasizing that Mumu was his elemental partner. It was the first time the group had seen him. Recalling how Mumu handled the protesters, Yu Jia-han realized the stark contrast between his cute appearance and immense power. Mumu explained he had been helping with construction and was quite busy. Doha, however, assured him it would only take a minute of his time. The elemental then turned his attention to Yu Jia-han, observing him in surprise before asking if he was the guest. Yu Jia-han, feeling slightly uncomfortable, awkwardly waved and greeted Mumu. A small elemental approached and began sniffing his outstretched hands. Kim Sai-hoo, watching this scene curiously, was impressed by the creature's behavior. The protagonist, on the other hand, internally questioned what Mumu was trying to do. Then Doha asked Yu Jia-han directly if he could release his own elemental. Yu Jia-han confirmed the nod, and in the next moment, a sphere of energy formed in his hand before flying toward the Earth Elemental. Mumu watched the energy and, recognizing its essence, exclaimed that it was an elemental. Doha, analyzing the interaction, stated that, as expected, was a wind elemental. Curious, he asked what its name was. Yu Jia-han responded immediately, Self. Doha repeated the name to himself and then revealed the reason he had brought them there. He explained that during his 17 years as an elementalist, only one elemental had ever been discovered in the country, Mumu, and that situation had never changed. Although he had studied various hero dossiers, he had never found any mention of a wind elemental. The only clue was Yu Jia-han's guild switch, but concluding that he had obtained an elemental just because of that seemed premature. It was something unprecedented. He then questioned how Yu Jia-han had managed to form a contract with the spirit of wind. The protagonist exchanged glances with Kim Sai-hoo, hesitating before responding. Kim Sai-hoo in turn placed a hand on her chest and offered to explain. She revealed that Self had already had another master before. When asked who it was, she answered without hesitation. Her mother. Doha furrowed his brow and scratched his chin, processing the information. He had never imagined that the wind elemental had previously belonged to someone else. Until that moment, it was believed that when a master died, their elemental disappeared along with them. However, that showed that the workings of elementals were still not fully understood. After a brief moment of reflection, Doha laughed. Although the mystery hadn't been solved, he decided it was better to set aside doubts for now and get straight to the point. Kim Sai-hoo stepped in, asking if Self was the main reason for the meeting. Doha raised two fingers and replied that, in fact, there were two reasons. From the beginning, he had wanted to talk about both reasons that had brought them there. The protagonist looked at the raised fingers and asked what the two matters were. Doha adjusted his glasses and, without beating around the bush, revealed his proposal. As the master of Dice Guild, he wanted to lead the Fun Guild. The heroes were shocked by the statement. Kim Sai-hoo, surprised, blurted out in nearly disbelieving, "Excuse me?" Doha, in turn, mentioned that he was offering 100% of Fun Guild's shares for 20 billion. Without wasting time, Kim Sai-hoo stood up, leaned her elbows on the table, and asked if he was really serious. Doha firmly assured her that he wouldn't joke about something like that. If they thought the amount wasn't enough, he could offer even more. In a more conciliatory tone, he explained that they could keep the two-person team as it was or hire another hero if they wished. Additionally, if they accepted his proposal, he himself would teach Yu Jia-han how to use elemental magic. He also guaranteed that he would not interfere with the team's activities under any circumstance. Then he leaned forward, rested his hands on his knees, and smiled before directly asking if they thought it was a good offer. Kim Sai-hoo, still hesitant, admitted that the proposal was excellent, but it seemed very sudden. Doha reassured the group, saying he would give them time to think it over. Leaning back on the armrest of his chair, he added that, naturally, the sooner they answered, the better. However, the protagonist's response was direct and firm. He didn't want it. Doha, surprised, asked why. Yu Jia-han stated categorically that they would never sell the Fun Guild. Meanwhile, Jang Se-man was approaching the demonstrators, who were still suspended in the air, observing the scene with surprise. With a puzzled look, he asked what happened there. He covered his face with one hand, analyzing the surrounding environment. Finally, he turned his attention to an item he was holding and, with a satisfied smile, commented that he could brag about having found something amazing. At that moment, Doha offered to increase the amount if the others didn't like the proposed deal. Yu Jia-han, lowering his head, showed resignation and mentioned that he had heard Doha had spent around 20 billion to erect a magical barrier around that place. However, to him, that value still wasn't enough, because he believed that a guild like Dice Guild, just like Fun Guild, should grow and become a large organization. As they exchanged glances, Kim Sai-hoo grabbed Yu Jia-han's clothes and began to cry, expressing her frustration that he was making that decision alone. Doha laughed mockingly at the scene and sarcastically asked if he really thought he could turn a two-person guild into something grand. To him, that kind of confidence seemed excessive. The protagonist, however, stood firm and replied that such conviction could indeed be called confidence. Upon hearing this, Doha adjusted his glasses and reflected on what had just been said. To him, Yoo Han truly seemed confident, which only reinforced his impression that this young man was a peculiar and intriguing individual. He then stood up from his seat, raised his hands, and without hesitation, declined the deal. The woman beside them, outraged by the sudden decision, tried to protest, arguing that he should at least hear her out before deciding. However, Doha simply snapped his fingers and pointed to the office entrance, stating that since they had come this far, he would give him something. Yoo Han then noticed that the secretary was standing at the door, holding a crystal in her hands. Upon recognizing the object, he wondered why Doha was returning it, as it was the same magical crystal from their previous meeting. His gaze fixed on the box containing the crystal cube before him, unable to hide his surprise. Doha, noticing his reaction, smiled and explained that the crystal would be given to him as soon as he took over the guild. For Doha, this proved how good he was as an elementalist mentor. Yoo Han opened the box lid and took out the crystal, examining it closely before accepting it with gratitude. However, his curiosity was piqued when he noticed an unusual sound coming from the object, not understanding the reason behind the sudden noise. His elemental, reacting to the presence of the crystal, glowed intensely and quickly moved closer to him. Yoo Han's surprise was evident at this unexpected reaction. Shortly afterward, a bright light filled the room, and Doha explained that elementalists could strengthen their powers by absorbing the energy contained in magical crystals. He emphasized that Yoo Han should collect them because by doing so, self could also materialize, just like Mumu. Still holding the glowing sphere, Yoo Han reflected on that possibility, pondering the moment when self would finally take on a physical form. Sometime later, at the Korean branch of the IUPC, a young operator adjusted her microphone and introduced herself as a member of the International Union for the Protection of Creatures. She asked how she could help and with a calm smile, listened to the requests on the other end of the line. The information she received indicated that a cat had transformed into a creature, and she assured them the case would be handled with care. Meanwhile, two nearby employees chatted cheerfully about a promotional poster they had discussed the day before. One of them asked how much longer it would take to complete the project, and the other estimated they needed 3 more days. The young woman then interrupted to ask when the next scheduled volunteer activity would take place. Her colleague, hesitant, replied that it would be on the 21st of that month. She commented that the last time they helped an elderly woman, it was clear how touched the lady had been by the affectionate gesture of receiving a hug. The employee next to her agreed, leaning back in his chair and observing that everyone there was kind. The young woman always felt sorry for those in need and saw that work as something meaningful. A recent article highlighted the organization's actions addressing creature protection, nonviolence, and promoting charity, such as distributing food to elderly people in need. The text also raised questions about the treatment of so-called monsters and whether the killings committed against them were truly just. The young workers agreed with that message and believed that spreading the idea that there was still goodness in the world was essential. To them, that was the organization's true mission because one day others would come to see that too. Suddenly, however, tension took over the room. The panic on their faces betrayed what was coming. Both turned around, horrified, upon realizing something wasn't right. One of them murmured, worried, and it seemed like feeding time. Her gaze turned to the cage where a saber-toothed tiger exuded a malicious aura, showing impatience. She concluded that it was indeed the right time for the children to have a snack, and so she turned to her colleague, asking what they should offer. The other suggested it be something lighter. As they reviewed their options, one of the employees noticed the presence of an elderly woman tied up on the floor, her mouth sealed with duct tape. The woman's desperate eyes met hers. With an indifferent expression, the young woman remarked that the old lady was still alive. Her colleague, crossing his arms, noted that for someone her age, she seemed rather playful. The elderly woman tried to speak, but the sound that came out was just a muffled moan. Without hesitation, the employee opened the cage and shoved her inside. The impact of the fall caused her to let out a cry of pain. As she watched the scene, the female worker casually said that this was the meal of the day. Tears streamed down the old woman's face as her body trembled with fear. The saber-toothed tiger slowly approached, opening its mouth and revealing its massive fangs. In the next moment, blood splattered across the room. The young woman, bringing a hand to her lips, smiled maniacally and commented that her cat looked adorable while eating. She then turned to her colleague and suggested with an eager look that maybe it would be a good idea to bring in more people to feed the beast. She raised her index finger and warned not to overfeed them, suggesting they'd bring just one more for dinner. Next, she turned around and noticed a car approaching, its headlights illuminating the path ahead. Her colleague, upon noticing the vehicle, exclaimed in surprise that it looked like the manager was arriving. From the car emerged the manager of the Korean branch of the IUPC, Min-Soo Lim, holding documents. With a smile on his face, the manager greeted the team, saying hello to everyone. The employees quickly gathered around him. One of the workers greeted him excitedly, asking how his business trip had gone. Min-Soo Lim at the front replied that he had brought many adorable and kind children, who were in the building next door and could be seen later. One of the employees, impressed, praised the manager, calling him a true hero. Min-Soo Lim then stepped up to the board, opened his arms, and asked for everyone's attention, announcing that he had good news. The employees, setting aside their tasks, turned to him with anticipation. With a calculated gesture, he opened his briefcase and revealed that the prototype of the object his partners had been researching for a long time was finally ready. He pulled out a weapon with an unusual appearance, catching the attention of one employee, who asked in surprise what it was. Min-Soo Lim, confident, approached the cage and asked if they remembered the basilisk recently discovered in the land of monsters in Bucheon. He explained that although they had managed to create a new variant by feeding the creature magical crystals, its body quickly decayed, and there were control issues. Observing the monster in the cage, he added that this time would be different. With a threatening smile, he pointed the weapon at the creature and declared that his child would be even better. He fired a single shot, causing the cage to light up. He then sighed and began to clap, joined by his colleagues. With satisfaction, he declared that it was indeed a magnificent creature. Sometime later, in the 4th class of the saber-toothed tiger's activity site, someone noticed that unlike the previous day, there was now a barrier. With a hand on their face, they reflected on the conflict with the IUPC and concluded that they had realized the saber-toothed tigers wouldn't be eliminated quickly. If they were lucky, maybe they could obtain a magical crystal of that variety that day. Kim Sai-hoo, surprised, looked at the protagonist, but before she could speak, Jang Se-im appeared behind him, grabbed his shoulders, and exclaimed indignantly that Yoo Jae-han had disappeared the previous day. The shock made Kim Sai-hoo bring her hand to her chest, gasping in alarm. Yoo Jae-han turned and asked if there was a problem. Jang Se-im, irritated, began waving his fists and shouted that they had left him alone out of nowhere, even though they had asked him to take care of the saber-toothed tiger. The protagonist, with an unconcerned expression, replied vaguely, taking the blame. Still indignant, Jang Se-im asked if he was being serious. His body trembled with frustration, and he crossed his arms over his chest, lowering his head. However, in the next moment, he threw his head back, covered his face with his hand, and began to laugh. Kim Sai-hoo, intrigued, asked if he had gone mad. Jang Se-im, with a mysterious smile, commented that he was wondering if they could keep that tiger for themselves. Then he showed his phone screen to the others, who leaned in to look. Their eyes widened in surprise. With a smile on his face, he revealed that he had sold the basilisks and the saber-toothed tiger from the day before. On the screen, a message indicated that the sale had brought in 500 million. Kim Sai-hoo, still in disbelief, placed a hand on the protagonist's shoulder and asked, stunned, what the exact amount was. Jang Se-im, throwing his head back and stepping to the side, confirmed with satisfaction that since it was the first time that type of basilisk had been discovered, he managed to sell it at a high price. Kim Sai-hoo, impressed, knelt before him, raised her hands, and exclaimed that she already knew she could trust him. Jang Se-im made a face and declared that he would sell anything he could for a good price. Suddenly, he remembered the commission and mentioned that he needed to talk about it with the group. Normally, he charged a 10% fee for collection and sales. The protagonist calmly replied, 4%. Jang Se-im, outraged, shouted Yoo Jae-han's name, asking what he meant by that. The protagonist repeated 4%, suggesting it was a standard rate for clients. Jang Se-im tried to negotiate, reducing it to 8%, but Yoo Jae-han remained firm, insisting on 4%. He raised his index finger and finalized the negotiation, saying, "Okay, thanks, 4%. Jang Se-im, furious, protested, asking how he could decide everything alone without considering the opinion of others. To him, Yoo Jae-han had always been an opportunist. As the scene unfolded, someone nearby curiously asked what those two were doing. Suddenly, Jang Se-im realized something and exclaimed that she was there again. He turned around, surprised, and saw a giant chinchilla approaching. In his mind, the question popped up automatically. What? Kim Sai-hoo, beside him, looked at Min Yuri and asked, amazed, if she was a tamer. His companion confirmed, adding that if it was her first time seeing her, she should know that she was Min Yuri from the Snowflake Guild. He explained that she was known for exclusively hunting saber-toothed tigers and was obsessed with them. Kim Sai-hoo, surprised, asked what the reason for that obsession was, but he admitted he didn't know. Kim Sai-hoo, watching Min Yuri, commented that she looked amazing. The protagonist then suggested that they quickly enter the monster territory. After all, that tamer was a specialist in hunting saber-toothed tigers, and if they took too long, her chinchilla would grab everything it found along the way. Suddenly, the chinchilla turned toward him. He, cautious, also turned, feeling a chill run down his spine. In his mind, a single question echoed. What? Kim Sai-hoo turned anxiously to Yoo Jae-han, hoping he would take some action. Min Yuri, however, replied that everything was fine and that he should just remain calm. A system window appeared before the protagonist, informing him that the probability of the monster in front of him attacking was less than 2%. In the next moment, the chinchilla licked his face. Kim Sai-hoo and Jang Se-im watched the scene, confused. Min Yuri commented that it was strange to see the creature showing interest in someone else. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear and smiling, she introduced herself, saying she was Min Yuri and represented the Snowflake Guild. Yu Jai-han, still being licked by the chinchilla, extended his hand cheerfully and responded that it was a pleasure to meet her. He introduced himself as Yu Jai-han from the Fun Guild and also mentioned the leader of his guild, Kim Sai-hoo. Min Yuri, a little confused, greeted them with a simple hello. Then she asked the protagonist if he had any hamsters at home. He replied that he didn't own any animals. Thoughtfully, she brought her fingers to her chin and commented that it was strange, as there was no reason for the chinchilla to act that way without a specific cause. Suddenly, Jang Se-am knelt and took Min Yuri's hand, introducing himself as the director of a company specialized in collecting monster remains. He offered his help in case she needed assistance dealing with creature corpses. Min Yuri politely declined, saying it wouldn't be necessary. He, however, smiled and insisted that she shouldn't act like that. At that moment, the chinchilla approached him from behind. One of the onlookers turned to his companion and asked him to look at Min Yuri talking to people from another guild. His comrade, surprised, asked if that ice woman wasn't the same person who had been speaking with Doha the day before. Yu Jai-han realized they were being watched and thought to himself that this could become a problem. Min Yuri, noticing the situation, politely apologized for attracting unwanted attention. She placed a hand on the chinchilla's shoulder and as she began to walk away, wished them good luck. The protagonist looked at Jang Se-am, who was lying in a puddle of chinchilla drool, and said good luck to them too. As he watched Min Yuri leave, he reflected on the fact that the last time he had seen news about her was 3 or 4 years ago. Considering her popularity, she should have already been promoted to 3rd class. However, she was still 4th class. Despite his curiosity, he concluded it was none of his business. He then turned his attention to Kim Sai-hoo, who was poking her companion with a stick, and suggested they go in as well. She agreed with the suggestion. Turning to Jang Se-am, Yu Jai-han said he could stay there, to which he replied with a simple, okay. After some time, they were walking down a long corridor inside a tall building. Kim Sai-hoo looked around and asked what was going on. They had already climbed 5 floors but hadn't encountered a single monster. Yu Jai-han suggested that maybe other guilds had cleared everything before they arrived. He placed a hand on his hip and commented that there wasn't much to do but keep climbing and searching. Kim Sai-hoo put her hand on her chest and suggested using the elevator. Yu Jai-han, however, questioned what they would do if the elevator got stuck midway. With no other option, they began climbing the stairs. Jang Se-am, using his last bit of strength to stay upright, was breathing heavily and holding onto the walls. Indignantly, he asked if making a mage climb that many stairs wasn't a bit much. Yu Jai-han replied that even mages needed to build endurance. Suddenly, a member of the Knife Guild looked down through the railing and shouted, asking who was there. Upon spotting the protagonist, Moon Hyun-jin asked, surprised, what those people were doing there. He pointed out that on the 1st floor there was a sign saying that buildings 207 to 209 were reserved points for the Knife Guild and that they should look elsewhere. Kim Sai-hoo, outraged, exclaimed that this was absurd. She asked if he even had any idea what she had to go through to get there. Moon Hyun-jin smiled and commented that those people seemed to not even understand Korean. He explained that a point was a strategic location to secure an advantageous position within the monster territory. If a large guild took a point, the other guilds had to respect that position, especially if the guild in question only had 2 people. Then he shouted that if they had understood, they should leave immediately. The protagonist, however, responded that it would be better if they disappeared. He pointed out that the Fun Guild wasn't an ordinary guild. He said he was aware of the rule against occupying monster territories and would file a formal complaint with the Ministry of Heroes about their actions. Moon Hyun-jin crossed his arms over his chest. The veins on his face bulged with rage. Furious, he declared that this guy was insane. Drawing his sword from its sheath, he threatened, asking if Yu Jai-han really believed the Ministry of Heroes would take responsibility for their lives. Yu Jai-han, intrigued, asked if that was a threat. He began to analyze the situation. In front of him stood a tank, 2 warriors, and a mage. Considering the layout of the place and the group's strategic position, he concluded it would be difficult to take all 4 down at once. They believed they had a good chance of winning. The system window confirmed that confidence, indicating an 80% chance of success. However, the warrior from the Knife Guild wasn't intimidated and charged at Yu Jai-han, shouting defiantly. The protagonist reacted quickly, blocking Moon Hyun-jin's attack with his sword without any hesitation. The enemy, surprised, realized that his strike had done nothing and turned to his allies, demanding they attack. The mage of the group, holding a book in one hand, raised the other to indicate he was ready to act. At the same time, Kim Sai-hoo prepared her spell, creating a magical symbol in the air with her staff. Soon after, she launched a water arrow against the enemy's fire magic, resulting in a powerful explosion in the middle of the battlefield. With the smoke barrier clearing, the heroes charged forward without hesitation. Moon Hyun-jin noticed the movement and alerted his guild, ordering them to chase after them. Kim Sai-hoo, however, acted first and formed a magic seal, conjuring a wall of fire to block the path. As the battle intensified, Yu Jai-han swung his sword through the air and attacked Moon Hyun-jin again. The warrior tried to defend himself, positioning his blade in front of him, but his hands trembled visibly. He struggled to understand how an opponent of the same rank as him could be so superior. Without giving him time to react, Yu Jai-han noticed the enemy was already weakened and struck him with a kick. knocking him to the ground. Moon Hyunjin, outraged, protested, claiming his guild wouldn't let this go unpunished. Yu Jae-han, unfazed, drove his sword into the concrete next to the fallen warrior's head and calmly asked whether the guild would really take responsibility for their lives. The mage from the Knife Guild hesitated before admitting that they had no chance of winning that fight. Kim Sai-hoo, holding her staff in one hand and a fire orb in the other, suggested that perhaps it would be best to end the confrontation right there. Moon Hyunjin looked at her in astonishment, realizing that his group was dealing with opponents far more powerful than he had imagined. With no other options, he ordered them to extinguish the fire conjured by Kim Sai-hoo. However, the mage responsible for water magic needed more time to cast his spell. Meanwhile, the group's tank, frustrated, grumbled about the lack of progress in the search for the saber-toothed tigers, believing they were just wasting energy. His complaint, however, was abruptly cut short. Something moved quickly in the shadows, and before he could react, the tank was seized by a gigantic creature. His screams of despair echoed through the area as the monster sank its fangs into his skull, killing him instantly. Horror spread among the members of the Knife Guild. Kim Sai-hoo, watching the scene, placed a hand on her chest and commented that they had heard screams coming from the emergency stairwell. Yu Jae-han, picking up on this information, immediately understood what was happening. His gaze sharpened. He activated his scanning ability and waited for the system's response. A window appeared before him, revealing a worrying result. The probability of Yu Jae-han leaving that place alive was only 0.5%. Yu Jae-han observed the monster in front of them and recognized it as a variation of the saber-toothed cat. The group looked at the creature in pure horror, and Kim Sai-hoo questioned whether that thing could really be a saber-toothed cat. The protagonist reflected that perhaps it was some kind of deity, as he had never seen such an impressive creature. The members of the Knife Guild were equally terrified, their bodies trembling before the threat. The guild's mage, in a state of shock, exclaimed, asking what kind of hellish creature that was. Moon Hyunjin, hesitant and overcome by fear, suggested that it might be an even rarer variation. Yu Jae-han tried to coordinate a defense, shouting for everyone to unite. However, Moon Hyunjin and the mage had already turned their backs and were fleeing in terror. Outraged, Yu Jae-han shouted for them to stop, reminding them that 4 people alone couldn't handle that threat. But seeing them disappear, he realized the magnitude of the problem and cursed their cowardice. He knew that facing that beast with just 2 people was complete suicide. The monster charged rapidly, and Yu Jae-han understood that an attack was imminent. Without wasting time, he drew his sword and attempted to block the blow. The creature's strength was absurd, and he felt his body tremble. Had his blade not been coated with elemental magic, it would have snapped in 2. He realized that he couldn't just defend himself. He needed to end the fight quickly. At that moment, Kim Sai-hoo cast a wind spell to slow the monster down and shouted for Yu Jae-han to strike. He charged forward with determination, activating his wind blades for a decisive blow. For a moment, he thought he had succeeded, but before he could react, the monster dodged with surprising agility. In the next moment, a giant paw struck him, hurling him violently against a wall. Dazed, Yu Jae-han wondered how the monster could be so fast. Kim Sai-hoo screamed his name in concern and fired wind arrows at the creature. The saber-toothed cat dodged the attacks easily and prepared for a counterattack. Kim Sai-hoo realized in horror that she wouldn't be able to dodge in time. At that moment, Minyuri's voice echoed, calling out for Chilla. The small chinchilla leaped toward the monster in a swift motion. With a powerful impact, the creature was thrown against the wall, breaking through it and crashing out of the building. Kim Sai-hoo stood in shock at the sight and murmured Chilla's name in disbelief. Minyuri approached calmly, explaining that they had heard the explosion and came to check on the situation. She smiled upon recognizing the members of the Fun Guild, saying she was happy to see them again. Kim Sai-hoo, still surprised, recognized Minyuri's name. Minyuri then turned her attention to Yu Jae-han, commenting that they would have been in serious trouble if she had arrived a bit later. She looked at the hole in the wall and said she would take care of the creature, asking the group to retrieve Moon Hyunjin along with Yu Jae-han. Kim Sai-hoo hesitated, doubting that Minyuri could handle that monster alone. She suggested calling for reinforcements from other heroes. Minyuri, however, reassured her, stating that she knew the saber-toothed tigers better than anyone. Kim Sai-hoo noticed that something in Minyuri's aura had changed. The next moment, the huntress leaped out of the opening in the wall. Chilla knocked the monster to the ground, making it tremble from the impact. Minyuri quickly ordered her companion to retreat and then cast her freezing rain spell. The attack enveloped the creature in ice, sealing it completely. For a moment, it seemed the battle was over, but then the monster roared and shattered the ice around it, breaking free. Minyuri jumped onto Chilla's back, surprised by the enemy's resilience. Even after being hit by countless ice arrows, it could still stand. She reflected that this variation really did possess unusual strength. The saber-toothed cat growled, fixing its gaze on them. Without hesitation, Minyuri gathered her energy for a final attack, declaring that the outcome wouldn't change. She launched a high-speed snow shot at the beast. However, To her surprise, the monster created multiple copies of itself. She understood that this saber-toothed tiger possessed both great strength and a specific weakness. In the next moment, the real monster collapsed to the ground, defeated. She commented that it wouldn't be able to get up again. She concluded that the abnormal agility of that species came from the flexibility of its muscles. However, when exposed to cold, the muscles contracted, making movement impossible. Without functional joints, the body couldn't support its own weight and collapsed. She adjusted the glove on her hand and declared that the battle had ended the moment her ice arrow hit the target. Watching the scene from above, Kim Sai-hoo couldn't believe what had just happened. The creature she and Yoo Jae-han had struggled so much to fight had been defeated before their eyes. The protagonist called out to her, and she immediately turned anxious. He warned that they needed to help Min Yuri immediately. She assured him there was nothing more to worry about as everything was already resolved. However, Yoo Jae-han insisted, saying that wasn't quite true. A system window appeared before him. The message revealed that the probability of Min Yuri defeating the saber-toothed tiger was less than 10%. He realized, alarmed, that she was still in danger. Min Yuri approached the fallen monster, preparing to deliver the final blow. She remembered that she would end it in the least painful way possible. However, before she could strike, the monster opened its mouth and let out a powerful roar. At that moment, several saber-toothed tigers in the area began running toward her. Kim Sai-hoo, holding Yoo Jae-han by the waist, watched the scene with urgency. She realized the roar had summoned all the nearby saber-toothed cats. The protagonist understood what was happening and realized they were in a desperate situation. He turned to Kim Sai-hoo and asked if she could use levitation. She replied hesitantly that her technique wasn't perfect, but she could manage it to some extent. Without hesitation, Yoo Jae-han grabbed her waist and said it was enough. Kim Sai-hoo shouted, outraged, asking where he thought he was putting his hands. Ignoring her complaint, Yoo Jae-han held her hand firmly and made a decision. With a single motion, he pulled her close and activated his acceleration. Kim Sai-hoo's eyes widened, feeling the sudden speed. Tears formed in her eyes as she screamed desperately for him to wait. She realized, too late, that he hadn't even explained what he was about to do. The monsters advanced toward Min Yuri, but she destroyed them with ease using her attacks. Suddenly, one of them tried to surprise her from behind. However, Shilla pinned it to the ground with a precise blow. Upon observing the remaining enemies, Min Yuri realized there were many of them. Wiping her face with the sleeve of her jacket, she mentally questioned where such creatures could have been hiding and concluded that they needed to resolve this situation quickly before it spiraled out of control. At that moment, Yoo Jae-han shouted to Kim Sai-hoo he used levitation. She responded by warning that she had already done so. He quickly realized she could slow the enemies down, but her strength wasn't enough to keep them suspended. Although he wanted to conserve mana, he realized there was no other choice. He concentrated energy in his hand and launched a wind bomb forward. Sai-hoo wanted to know if it had worked. Yoo Jae-han charged forward, understanding he had to aim with the same precision he used to destroy the basilisk of the variant type. Using his wind blade, he cut through multiple monsters, causing destruction all around. Upon landing, he supported himself on his sword, breathing heavily. It was clear he was trying to use his mana as efficiently as possible, though it was physically draining. Min Yuri quickly approached and, annoyed, reminded the group that she had asked them to stay back. The protagonist turned around, stood up, and asked seriously if that was all she had to say after they came to help her. Min Yuri replied, irritated, that she didn't need anyone's help and that she could handle everything on her own. The protagonist then asked what was going on with the saber-toothed tigers. Upon hearing the question, Min Yuri glanced in his direction while the chinchilla beside her let out an irritated squeak. Shilla looked ahead and, alarmed, realized that the previous attack hadn't eliminated all the enemies. Saber-toothed tigers began emerging from the rubble. The protagonist noticed that these felines weren't the same as before, and the monsters seemed to be summoning more creatures. Surprised, Min Yuri realized the joints of the main creature had already been restored. Yoo Jae-han declared that he didn't understand how that was possible, but suspected the cat had regenerative abilities, something he had never seen in saber-toothed tigers. Before he could explain further, Min Yuri recalled her injured sister, begging her to flee during the battle. Looking at her blood-covered hands, she was overtaken by horror. Back in the present, the protagonist walked toward her, turned around, and commented that most of the enemies had already been defeated, while the main one was only lightly injured. He believed that if they all worked together, they could defeat it. However, Min Yuri didn't listen and rushed ahead. The protagonist, outraged, shouted her name and wondered why she was acting so recklessly, concluding that it was no surprise she preferred working alone. Determined, he asked Sai-hoo to cover him. She ran to him and replied that she understood. Meanwhile, several saber-toothed tigers charged toward the group, but Min Yuri managed to repel them with her attacks. Soon, she was positioned in front of the main monster. One of the tigers tried to ambush her from behind, and she shouted that she didn't need interference. However, another feline approached her from the side, and Min Yuri realized in alarm that the monster had regained its strength with incredible speed. When the creature tried to strike her with its paw, the protagonist was already approaching, drawing his sword. He remarked that if he were the monster, he wouldn't eat something cold, as it would cause a stomachache. Then he launched a direct attack with all his energy. The chinchilla followed him, delivering precise blows, while Kim Sai-hoo used her wind magic to pierce the enemy's body. The protagonist was confident that victory was near. He leaped for the final blow, but was stopped by Min Yuri, who stepped in front of the monster, shielding it with her body, and asked him not to kill it. Surprised, the protagonist stopped and asked what she was doing. He said they needed to destroy the monster before it regenerated, but Minhyuri insisted she needed a saber-toothed tiger alive because she wanted to capture that rare species without harming it. Not understanding her reasons, the protagonist questioned her sanity, stating that she shouldn't interfere. When Minhyuri prepared to attack, she hesitated and shouted that she couldn't. The protagonist was furious and asked why she was acting that way. At that exact moment, the saber-toothed tiger behind them began to glow and rose onto its feet. Yoo Jae-han watched the scene in horror, wondering what was happening. He realized more tigers were approaching and Kim Si-hoo shouted, warning that the monster was calling reinforcements. Yoo Jae-han, concerned about his limits, thought his mana was nearly depleted and wondered what they would do next. Suddenly, Jun-woo intervened, calling the situation pathetic. He extended his hand forward, channeling energy and activated gravity control at 9 grams intensity. Kim Si-hoo, alarmed, asked who they were. Yunsik, observing the others, commented that they still behaved like amateurs. The protagonist furrowed his brow, thinking that even after passing the promotion test, they still couldn't handle a few cats. The disappointment was evident. Hans Soo, with an ironic smile, cracked his knuckles and claimed he wasn't a prodigy after all. Hyen in turn admitted she was impressed they had lasted this long. Drawing her sword, she prepared to fight. Yunsik asked them to stop chatting and suggested they finish the battle quickly. Yoo Jae-han thought of Bang Yunsik's team. While all of this was happening, Min Soo-lin watched from atop a building. With a slight smile, he commented that the big shots had finally shown up. Looking through binoculars, he said he believed it was the third-class team from the Data Guild. He had hoped a first-class group would join the fight, but it seemed he had waited too long. Then he lowered the binoculars with a smile. A subordinate approached and asked what the next step would be. Min Soo-lin replied that for now, there was nothing else to do and suggested they retreat. Although it wasn't a victory, it hadn't been a defeat either. The only issue was that the mana crystal had dispersed throughout the body at the last moment. Even so, the power stored within it was impressive, and the team would continue to follow the schedule. At that moment, standing among the corpses of the saber-toothed felines, Hans Soo questioned in disbelief what was going on. Yunsik replied that it seemed the heroes department would have a lot of work ahead. Both watched anxiously as the mutant monster continued to grow in size. Meanwhile, people wearing special suits were helping the heroes exit from inside the creature. Minhyuri and Shilla passed through the barrier, and Minhyuri turned to look back one last time. 1 week later, in the casual building of the guild, the protagonist was lying on the sofa staring at his phone screen. On the screen, it read, 20 casualties per inch in the 4th class monster territory. It was an article addressing the need to revise the current system for classifying monster territories. The text suggested that more discussion was necessary to update the classification of the saber-toothed tiger to meet the criteria of the heroes department. Someone approached and asked what had happened at that place. Clenching his fist, the protagonist replied that the monster territory they had visited had been in the news for several days. According to him, it seemed those involved had gone through many hardships. Without looking away from the corner of the screen, he declared he didn't want to talk about the matter with ordinary people. He added that if Jang Se-am insisted, he would make her go through something just as difficult. Jang Se-am protested indignantly, saying they were business partners and she had the right to know everything. The protagonist looked up at the ceiling and thought maybe they shouldn't have hired him in the first place. That day, all 8 heroes who entered the monster territory died. The heroes department had severely underestimated the number of saber-toothed tigers hiding in the underground parking lot. The sudden appearance of the species caused panic among the creatures, culminating in a tragedy. He felt a bad premonition about what had happened. Yoo Jae-han removed the bandage from his cheek and thought that everything had been too well planned to be just an accident. Furthermore, the species mutation was something he had never seen before. Despite his suspicions, he decided not to dwell too much on it, hoping the heroes department would release the investigation results soon. Jang Se-am looked away and commented that she just realized she hadn't seen Kim Si-hoo that day. The protagonist lowered his head and explained that Kim Si-hoo had taken a week off to handle personal matters. Suddenly, he noticed his phone ringing. Surprised, he wondered if it was really a call. Monson commented that he had never seen that phone ring before. Yoo Jae-han approached and said it was the guild's direct line, the same one all guilds had. In his mind, he questioned who would be calling that line. When he answered, he identified himself as being from the Fun Guild. On the other side of the line, Minhyuri introduced herself. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise. Jang Se-am turned toward him, also surprised. Putting on his 3D glasses, Jang Se-am opened his mouth in shock and mentally asked where his popcorn was. Minhyuri apologized for calling the direct line, explaining it was the only way she could contact them. The protagonist replied that he understood. She then asked about his injuries. He explained it had been a week, and his wounds were almost healed. He returned the question, asking how she was doing. Looking out the window, Minhyuri said she was great. There was a brief silence during which the protagonist thought it unlikely she had called just to check on him. Then Minhyuri asked if Yoo Jae-han could meet her that day. Surprised, he repeated the word today. He stood there, mouth agape, still holding popcorn and soda, unable to believe the situation. Meanwhile, Kim Si-hoo answered another call while wrapping a cloth around her staff. She greeted her father, who asked how she was after the encounter with the new species in the 4th class monster territory. He wanted to know if she had been injured. Kim Si-hoo assured him she was fine. Her father warned her to be careful in dangerous areas, reminding her that a hero's support often becomes a target more frequently than expected. Saw closed his eyes, showing irritation, and seriously said he had heard that warning hundreds of times. He emphasized that if they saw invaders, they should just retreat. She replied that she was aware. Her father, Kim Ji-ono, the chief researcher at the Kyoto Monster Research Institute, expressed satisfaction knowing she was working with someone reliable. Kim Si-hoo, a bit embarrassed, said Yoo Jae-han had been a great help to the guild. She said that if she hadn't met him, she would still be stuck. He commented that he would like to meet him someday. He took out a photograph and observed the hero who had inherited his mother's elements. He showed great interest in learning more about him. At that moment, an employee entered the office and informed Kim Ji-ono that he was needed to study a newly arrived sample. Kim Ji-ono adjusted his glasses and said he would be there shortly. He asked them to start without him if necessary. Before leaving, he said he had to go because something had happened. Kim Si-hoo looked at the phone worriedly and asked when he would come to Korea. He answered that he would come for his mother's death anniversary and that they would talk more then. She commented that it was typical for him to say just what was necessary. Then she stretched and said she needed to take care of household chores. At that moment, Jang Se-am called her. Looking at the phone, she wondered why he would be calling now. Later, the protagonist was on the street and recalled when Jang Se-am, smiling, had handed him a bracelet. He said that lucky whiskers would bring good luck. He wished him luck with whatever came his way. The protagonist looked at the bracelet on his hand and thought he only wore it so Jang Se-am would stop whining. Soon after, Min-yuri called him. He turned at the sound of her voice, who asked if he had left her waiting. Looking at her, he thought she seemed different from when they met in the monster territory. He said he had just arrived. She sighed with relief and commented that it was a relief. Then she walked ahead, informing him that she had already reserved a table and suggested he accompany her there. He agreed, and the two walked together. Outside, Kim Si-hoo and Jang Se-am, who were watching them, reacted with indignation. They were incredulous to see them dining together, and Si-hoo asked what Yoo Jae-han was thinking. Clenching his fists, he thought that Min-yuri had had the audacity to aim her arrow at them in the monster territory, but now she was there, talking with Yoo Jae-han as if nothing had happened. He imagined that this could only be a plan to remove him from the leadership of the guild. Despite that, he concluded that it definitely wasn't the case. Both continued watching through the window of the restaurant where Yoo Jae-han and Min-yuri were seated. Min-yuri, holding a glass of water, commented that the food was delicious. Yoo Jae-han, sitting across from her, agreed. Kim Si-hoo mentally insisted it wasn't that, but she couldn't convince herself. Min-yuri took a sip of coffee and said the aroma was incredible. The protagonist nodded again. Next, the two were seen at a shooting range, where Min-yuri hit a shot. The protagonist, with his hands in his pockets, complimented her performance. Later, they walked down the street, and he asked if she wanted him to carry her teddy bear for her. Min-yuri said it was okay. Meanwhile, as asked Kim Si-hoo if she could see anything suspicious. Kim Si-hoo firmly believed they were on a date. She raised her fist and struck Jang Se-am, who fell to the ground crying in pain. Looking at her, he shouted, asking if she wasn't going to do something about it. She just walked away in the opposite direction, adjusting her cap. She asked herself why she should care about who he wanted to date. She knew she shouldn't, but she still felt irritated. Later, Yoo Jae-han stretched his shoulders, loosening his joints, and commented with a smile that the moment was fun. He said it had been a long time since he had gone out and enjoyed himself like that. Min-yuri, holding the teddy bear in her hands, agreed, saying she felt much better thanks to him. The protagonist could no longer contain his curiosity and asked if it wasn't time for her to explain why she had arranged that meeting. She was surprised by the question. He explained that since she asked to meet him, he imagined she had something important to say. Min-yuri looked down and confessed that actually she just wanted company. Soon after, they arrived in front of a building, and Yoo Jae-han, surprised, asked if it was a hospital. She confirmed, saying that her sister was being treated there. As they walked through the corridors, he thought to himself that Min-yuri's sister must be sick. When they entered the room, he said, "I'm sorry." At that moment, his eyes suddenly shone, and he realized his ability had been activated. Min-yuri introduced her younger sister, still very young. A system window appeared before the protagonist. The message indicated, current status, unconscious. Mana discoloration syndrome progression, 95%. He was shocked to read, mana discoloration syndrome. Min-yuri, placing the teddy bear beside her sister, said he was probably wondering why she only hunted saber-toothed tigers. She told him that years ago, they were attacked by one of those monsters, and since then, her sister had been in a coma. She said the doctors did not know the exact cause. Yoo Jae-han understood that this was why she pursued those monsters. She confirmed, explaining that she hoped to find some clue. She thought she might have made a mistake. She believed that by studying and maybe curing the species, she could find a way to help her sister. But the reports she read that day showed no connection between the monsters and her sister's condition. She apologized for her behavior in the monster territory. She said she knew that he and Kim Sai-hoo had been in danger because of her. Bowing to him, she showed regret. Yu Jai-han awkwardly crossed his hands in front of his body and asked her not to worry. He said he understood. Suddenly, another system window appeared before him. The message said, Min Yuri, Snowflake Guild profile. Most important figure for the growth of the Fun Guild. Current progress. 1 of 4 collected. He was intrigued, and you began to wonder if their guild really needed her. Yu Jai-han remembered having seen that probability statistic before during Chang Sai's rescue in the Dark Matter. He then told Kim Sai-hoo they thought it was time to stop what they were doing. At that moment, a system window appeared before him showing a new inscription analysis. Jang Sayan was the most important figure for the growth of the Fun Guild at that moment. For Yu Jai-han, it seemed like his ability was trying to guide him to some kind of mission, something he had never noticed before. Not even when he had hired Monson to work in the guild, just to see how his ability would react. Did it manifest like this? Now, for the second time that same day, the ability was activated and also reacted to Min Yuri's presence. If he had already found one of the 4 essential elements, including Min Yuri, then 3 were still missing to complete that mission. Raising his hand to his eye, he reflected on the situation. Min Yuri, sensing something strange, reached out to him and asked if he was feeling okay. He answered yes, that he was just a little dizzy. At that moment, he remembered that when he met the Fun Guild, his ability had predicted with 99% certainty that it would become great after his joining. Now, out of nowhere, new requirements were appearing, yet never imagined his analysis ability could play tricks on him. In any case, he was determined he would do whatever was necessary. Curious, Yu Jai-han asked how long Min Yuri had been hunting saber-toothed tigers. She seemed confused by the question, but answered that it had been about 4 years. He then wanted to know if during that time she had found any clue on how to get her sister out of the coma. She confirmed that this was true. Yu Jai-han commented that maybe it wasn't his place to say, but considering she still hadn't found the solution, he didn't think it would be a bad idea to try a new approach. Faced with the suggestion, Min Yuri looked at him and asked what exactly he was talking about. With a calm gesture, Yu Jai-han took an ointment and held her hand, saying he would give a simple example. He explained that when suffering a cut or wound, the usual procedure was to disinfect the area and apply some ointment. Then he rolled up his sleeve and showed the scars on his arm, asking if she knew which product he usually used. She shook her head and he pointed to the scars, explaining that one of the most common ingredients in the ointment was Centella asiatica, also known as Indian pennywort. It's a very common plant found in mountains and fields with antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties among other beneficial effects. He continued saying that although those plants had not yet turned into monsters, many researchers believed that simply applying the leaves or stems wouldn't help heal open wounds. It was the extract that had the healing properties. He found it interesting how these small plants, even without direct relation to the cause of the wound, were an essential part of the healing process. Min Yuri looked away and stayed silent, perhaps thinking that her sister was in a similar situation. Maybe the cause of the critical condition was not directly linked to the saber-toothed tigers. In Yu Jai-han's mind, it was obvious that Min Yuri already knew this, even without him having to say it. Still, she kept going forward, driven by an obsession for revenge against the monsters that had hurt her sister. In silence, she approached the unconscious girl and placed her hand on her head. It was at that moment that Yu Jai-han revealed he had a proposal. Upon hearing that, she turned with a surprised expression. He explained that he wanted to formally hire her. She, surprised, asked if he really intended for her to join the Fun Guild. He confirmed firmly. He said that if she accepted, everyone in the guild would do their best to help find a cure for her sister. He assured her it was not an empty promise, and that they could even include it in the contract if that would make her feel more secure. Min Yuri put her hands to her chest and looked at him with some embarrassment. Yu Jai-han then activated his analysis ability. A new system window appeared before him with important data: probability of Mino Yan waking up from the coma, chances of Min Yuri finding a cure, possibility of her sister's recovery if she joined the Fun Guild. The current status indicated unconscious syndrome, mana discoloration progression, 95%. For him, it seemed the ability was reaffirming what it had shown before. Although it couldn't guarantee Mino Yan's recovery, he knew he needed to recruit Min Yuri by all possible means. She then asked, somewhat shyly, if she could think it over before giving an answer. Yu Jai-han extended his hand with a light smile and replied that there was no problem. Min Yuri thanked him, and he concluded that at that moment, the best thing was to let her reflect calmly. Then he left the room and waved to her, saying he didn't want to disturb her any longer and would leave her alone. She nodded, saying it was okay, and apologized for having dragged him there. The protagonist looked at his own hand, took off his bracelet, and said he needed to give her something. She approached and asked what it was about. He then placed the bracelet in her hands and explained it was made of lucky whiskers, an item known to bring good luck. He also commented that he thought it would suit her sister better than him. She smiled, accepted the gift gently, and thanked him, saying she was sure Soyan would like the bracelet. The protagonist turned to leave and informed her he was going now, hoping for a quick answer. She smiled shyly and just replied with an "ok bye." Sometime later, at the Ministry of Heroes, the head of the Cause Guild parked and Jun crossed his arms, saying they were already late. A ministry employee walked to the podium, took the microphone, and announced that they had waited enough. Even with the absence of one of the guilds, the meeting had to start. Doha entered the room scratching his head and with ironic seriousness asked who was responsible for calling a meeting at such an absurd time. To him, it seemed like there wasn't even anyone important there. Park Jung-zap reprimanded him, reminding him that he had said many times they needed to hurry. Doha put his hands in his pockets and commented that he was already involved in trouble elsewhere, so he didn't see the point in being there, especially with the leader of the Warriors Guild. Kang Junil, with his arms crossed, indignantly retorted that for someone late, he was talking too much. He said it was obvious that everyone was just waiting for him, calling him a lazy idiot. Doha looked at him, smiled, and mocked, saying it seemed like someone had come back from the dead. He mentioned hearing that his guild had been destroyed by a first-class guild. Kang Junil stood up angrily, clenched his fists, and shouted that it would take much more than that to defeat them. He declared that they had eliminated that guild a long time ago. Doha just laughed in response. The master of the Red Hall Guild, Bak Gang Chien, sighed deeply and asked if it was really necessary to make so much noise. He rested his face on his hand and commented that even being a guild leader, Kang Junil was still immature. He said he thought Kang Junil would have learned his lesson after being beaten up, but realized that it had no effect at all. Kang Junil frowned and confronted him, asking if Bak Gang Chien had any complaints to make, to call them outside to settle it. Bak Gang Chien refused the challenge and questioned why he would waste time fighting a visibly weaker opponent. In a provocative tone, he mentioned that in their fight history minus 103 matches, Jun had won 52 and lost 51, while Doha had won 51 and lost 52. Kim Minjong, leader of the Snowball Guild, watched the scene and disdainfully commented that they still tried to silence each other. She accused them of acting like children, questioned why men always felt the need to prove something. Doha then turned to her with a smile and said it had been a long time since they last saw each other. He asked if 3 years had already passed and joked if she was trying to look older on purpose. Kim Minjong slammed the table indignantly, asking who he thought he was calling old. Doha settled into the chair, resting his elbows on the backrest and putting his feet on the table, saying she was still as quarrelsome as before. His vice leader discreetly warned him that no woman liked to be called old. The Ministry of Heroes employee, noticing all the guild leaders were finally present, suggested they start the meeting. He informed them they had been called urgently because new information had arisen about the Class 4 incident that happened in Incheon the previous week. They had found evidence indicating the direct involvement of the IUPC. Doha, surprised and interested, laughed and questioned if that meant they could raid their headquarters. Kim Minjong waved her hand and questioned whether Doha was really thinking carefully about what he was saying. She explained that the IUPC operate on a global scale, and that mere proof of involvement was not enough to justify any direct action. She asked why he thought the guilds had tolerated their activities for so long. The Ministry of Heroes official took back the microphone and confirmed that she was right. He said that the Hero Department did not have solid enough evidence to act decisively. He warned that if they were not careful, this could escalate into a diplomatic problem. Soon after, he asked everyone to look at the screen. The image showed a creature resembling a saber-toothed tiger. The heroes reacted with surprise and astonishment. One of them commented that they had never seen monsters of that type before. Gang Qian observed that the creature looked particularly repulsive. The official continued, explaining that those felines were very different from ordinary monsters. He reported that the Hero Department had received several complaints about deformed variants like this one. He mentioned the emergence of a mutant variety of red weaver ants on Mount Gian, and he recalled that months ago a large number of Dallin variants had appeared at a private country club. He said that just like the saber-toothed tigers, these monsters exhibited unusual deformities. Kang Junil asked what the point of all this was, since the appearance of new monsters was not uncommon. The official partially agreed but explained that based on the monster's appearance, they could not be classified as simple special variants. He revealed that DNA analyses conducted by the Monster Research Department had identified a new genetic variation exclusive to the saber-toothed tigers. Kim Minjong reacted with surprise, asking if he was really talking about a new genetic variation. She asked him to get straight to the point. The official explained that inside the creature, there was a mana crystal. He reminded them that mana crystals are special materials that normally appear in various monster species. He said the department concluded that these variants appear when mana crystals with high energy content fuse with monsters. Still, he warned that these mana crystals could not be artificially created with current technology. However, the crystal found in that new variant was different. It had been artificially created, and more surprisingly, it was in liquid form. One of those present reacted in shock, asking if he was really claiming that someone had manufactured a liquid mana crystal. He pointed out that current technology did not allow for such creation. He then asked who could have done that. Hyung turned to Doha and asked if he knew anything about it. Doha denied, saying he had no idea. He only knew mana crystals as energy sources that elementals tend to absorb. He suspected that the recent increase in unknown species might be linked to experiments with liquid mana crystals. With a manic smile, he said he had no doubt about who was behind those grotesque experiments. Gang Qian commented that all of this was interesting, but there was still one unanswered question. He wanted to know what the connection was between all of this and the IUPC. He reminded everyone that at the start of the meeting, there had been mention of evidence linking the IUPC to the case. One of the workers intervened and reported that on the day of the saber-toothed tiger incident, suspicious individuals were seen at the guild facilities. They had been captured by a surveillance drone. The person shown in the images was identified by facial recognition software. His name was Lim Min Soo. He was 33 years old, and the department was sure he was a manager of the IUPC. He had previously worked as a researcher in the Department of Magical Engineering, but had been dismissed 4 years ago. Gang Qian asked for more information, inquiring about which incident it was about. The official replied that records indicated he had stolen a mana crystal from the research center. He also stated that Lim had conducted illegal human experiments. Based on the evidence, the Hero Association considered him the prime suspect in the case. To apprehend him as soon as possible, they were requesting everyone's cooperation in the investigation. Later, Yu Jiahan was standing at a bus stop. A nearby young man pointed his cell phone at him and commented to a friend that the guy was worth paying attention to. The other asked what was strange about the clothes he wore and if he happened to think he was a hero. They laughed together, mocking the idea that a hero would be waiting for the bus at that hour. Meanwhile, the protagonist was typing messages to Sai-Hu. He wanted to know if she was coming to the office that day because he had something important to tell her. He noticed that Sai-Hu still hadn't woken up and wondered why she hadn't responded. He told himself he needed to talk to her today. Even without Min-Yuri's reply, he thought it better to soon discuss the possibility of hiring her. He thought that with her experience, she would be an excellent addition to the guild, even without considering his special ability. He sighed, recognizing that the only problem was the lack of funds. Bringing someone like Min-Yuri would be expensive. Still, he recalled they had some money saved. Jang Sam had made a good profit selling monster scrap. If they negotiated well, maybe they could pay enough to hire her. At that moment, a taxi stopped beside him. The driver asked if he wasn't going to get in. He ran to the car hurriedly and answered yes, of course. He told himself he needed to go to the office. After getting in the car, he turned to the driver and asked to be dropped off at the corner of 5th Street. The taxi driver confirmed and then, looking at him through the rearview mirror, asked if he was one of the heroes. It was obvious from the clothes he wore. Yu Jiahan confirmed the driver was right with a slight smile. The man behind the wheel laughed, excited by the situation, thinking he never imagined giving a ride to a hero. He thought he would definitely tell this story to his taxi colleagues during lunch. Yu Jiahan found the gesture kind and thanked him with good humor. The driver then looked at the young man more closely and guessed he must be from one of the big guilds, given his posture and firm gaze. He mentioned well-known names like the Red Hall, the Warriors, the Dice, and even the Face Guild, all recently prominent. Yu Jiahan simply denied and explained that he was part of a new guild called Fun, probably unknown to most. To his surprise, the driver recognized the name and associated the guild with the recent saber-toothed tiger case at the Green Cape Apartments. Yu Jiahan was astonished and wanted to know how he knew about that. The driver replied with a smile, saying he lived in that area. The coincidence surprised Yu Jiahan even more, and he expressed his gratitude. The driver glanced outside the car, lamenting having witnessed that so early in the morning. Yu Jiahan followed his gaze and realized they were talking about the young hybrid girl on the street. The driver confessed that hybrids made him uncomfortable. Yu Jiahan wanted to know why and heard that because of the animal nature of those beings, there were rumors they could lose control. The hero noted that she looked just like a normal high school girl wearing a school uniform. He guessed she was a transformed hybrid. The driver, however, insisted that it didn't matter her appearance or age. According to him, hybrids were not like humans, and while heroes might be able to deal with that, ordinary people like him wouldn't stand a chance against an attack. Yu Jiahan remained silent, reflecting. He knew that after so many invasions and tragedies, it was natural for ordinary people to carry such prejudice. But still, she was just a child. He thought about how many times she must have been judged for being a half-elf. And then something caught his attention. Two suspicious figures appeared behind the girl, entering an alley. He immediately suspected their intentions. He warned the driver that he was going to get off right there. The driver protested, reminding him that they were still far from the destination. But Yu Jiahan had already jumped out of the car, leaving the driver indignant for not having been paid the fare. The hybrid, for her part, sensed she was being followed and took off running. The pursuers noticed and hurried after her, complaining that she had noticed their approach. One of them managed to grab her and pressed a cloth with a sedative substance against her face, preventing her from screaming. With satisfaction, he commented that she was a young hybrid, the kind of prey that was very valuable. The other agreed, saying they had hit the jackpot and that their most important clients would be happy. It was at that moment that Yu Jiahan arrived. He appeared beside them, interrupting the scene, and asked what they were doing. Faced with the threat, the two men hesitated. Yu Jiahan warned that he would count to 3, and if they didn't release her, they would die. With his hand already on the hilt of his sword, he began counting without waiting for a response. He ran forward, determined. He thought 3 seconds was way too long. However, before he could attack, a huge man appeared in front of him, blocking the way. With an intimidating look, he made it clear that this was none of Yu Jia-han's business. He said that he shouldn't get involved even if he was a hero. Yu Jia-han stopped for a moment and, surprised, mentally questioned who that man was. Sometime later, at the headquarters of the Fun Guild, Sia stood beside the table, staring intently at the phone that kept ringing. Sitting on the sofa, Yu Jia-han watched her and asked why she hadn't responded to his messages yet. Irritated, she shouted that it wasn't him who was sending messages. It was just spam. Still, she picked up the phone and asked, almost reluctantly, why he was trying to contact her. Yu Jia-han smiled and said he guessed she was still upset about what had happened the day before. She lost patience and told him to shut up. She demanded explanations, why he had been away for so long and why he had sent such messages. She said that if she had noticed something strange, she would have been genuinely scared. The messages he had sent seemed alarming. Someone said they needed to talk urgently, that it was very important, and that they had to meet at a certain time. She was confused, not really understanding. Yu Jia-han said he thought someone might be trying to steal or confiscate her equipment. She found that absurd, wondering who on earth would be interested in something like that. Later, at the gateway, Yu Jia-han positioned himself in front of the bandits, his body on guard, ready to fight. He asked directly if the man in front of him was working with that group. The man identified as C013 blocked his path and warned that if Yu Jia-han simply stepped aside, no one would blame him for anything, but since he had decided to interfere, that meant he needed to die right there. Yu Jia-han didn't take his eyes off his opponent. He noticed the movement of his hand coming toward him and realized this was not someone to negotiate with. Stai-013 punched the ground, causing a crack, and demanded to know where the hero was. Yu Jia-han appeared behind him and replied that the hero was right there, just behind him. Startled, the opponent turned around, violently waving his arms, swearing he would kill the so-called hero. At that moment, Yu Jia-han managed to position his sword under the enemy's arm, and a purple aura of energy filled the environment. The confrontation between the two was intense and prolonged. Yu Jia-han assessed that his adversary's attack was clearly imbued with mana. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to block his blade. He concluded he was indeed dealing with another hero. Meanwhile, the rest of the criminal group was loading boxes of medicine into a vehicle, hurrying to leave. They shouted that they had to move quickly and get everything into the car before someone interrupted them. Yu Jia-han noticed the movement and, gritting his teeth, concluded that if he didn't act fast, they would escape. Sai-013 prepared another attack, yelling at his opponent not to turn his back. He struck the ground again but missed because Yu Jia-han had jumped to the side. The hero thought about limiting the damage considering they were in a residential area, but knew he couldn't hesitate any longer. He had to defeat him once and for all. Not far away, Sai-015 watched the scene calmly. He decided to intervene, saying the fight had gone too far. He couldn't allow them to destroy the entire neighborhood. Yu Jia-han noticed the interference and stayed alert. Sai-015 smiled, relieved that they were in a hurry. He said that normally they killed all witnesses, but there was no time to deal with him that day. Yu Jia-han studied him carefully, noticing that this man was also capable of manipulating mana. They were all involved somehow. Sai-015 called a colleague, reminding him the mission was supposed to be completed quietly. He complained that even though it was the partner's first job, he had already caused too much trouble. Maybe the boss wanted to talk to him personally afterward. Sai-013 grumbled that there was nothing left to say and decided to retreat. He punched the wall as a warning and said goodbye in a threatening tone. Yu Jia-han tried to avoid the debris and watched the two with his eyes. Seconds later, the two criminals disappeared. He sheathed his weapon, frustrated, realizing they had escaped. Something didn't seem right about them, and it bothered him. Even so, he couldn't waste time. He needed to find them. He leaped across the rooftops, floating in the air as he used his analysis ability. He wanted to predict where the truck was headed. As he advanced, the area ahead divided into squares, each with a percentage indicating the chance of successfully finding them there. He continued following the trail, convinced he would catch up soon. At that moment, his phone rang. He answered quickly and asked Sai-hu if she was already on her way to the place he had indicated. She replied yes, that she was already in a taxi, but asked, confused about the kidnapping. She hadn't understood well. Yu Jia-han confirmed firmly. He said he had seen the moment when they kidnapped a young hybrid. Worried, she repeated the question, fearing she had heard wrong. He explained he was following the kidnappers and needed her to call the police immediately. He promised he would get back in touch as soon as he had news. Sai-hu ended the call with a heavy heart. She stared at the phone silently. She frowned, reflecting on what he had just said. Another kidnapping involving someone of another species. She recalled that a wave of hate crimes between species had been spreading for some time, and wondered, anguished, why it still hadn't stopped. The protagonist found himself in front of an abandoned house with broken windows and walls covered in soot. He approached silently, feeling a growing tension in his chest. His eyes caught something familiar, a truck parked in the corner of the lot, partially hidden by bushes. He was sure it was the same vehicle he had seen before. Inside, a man was curled up asleep in the driver's seat, his face partially hidden by an ordinary mask. Yu Jia-han approached and knocked on the window with his knuckles. waiting for a reaction. The man woke up with a start. His eyes blinked several times before focusing on the visitor outside. In an instant, fear took over him. He began trembling visibly while clutching his phone with both hands. Frightened, he screamed in panic, asking how that guy had managed to find them. Yu Jai-han, wasting no time, broke the window with a sharp strike and snatched the phone from his hands. With a dry, ironic tone, he commented that maybe the other hadn't heard him knocking, and that you shouldn't keep him waiting. He ordered him to get out of the car immediately. The masked man hesitated, trembling, asking him to wait, saying he wasn't a hero and that he could explain everything. But Yu Jai-han didn't want to listen anymore. He ripped the door off brutally and started pulling him out of the vehicle, ignoring the panicked screams. The blade of his sword gleamed under the dull moonlight as he positioned it against the kidnapper's neck. With controlled coldness, Yu Jai-han informed him that, as a hero, he had the right to arrest any criminal caught in the act, and if necessary, decide whether he would live or not. He gave him one last chance to explain himself. The man muttered almost inaudible curses, while on the other side of the property, inside the abandoned building, the real horror was unfolding. The room was damp, dark, smelling of mold mixed with fear. Hostages were tied up in rows, their bodies still and trembling with terror. A burly figure entered carrying a young woman over his shoulder as if she were just another piece of merchandise. When he placed her in front of another man with a more imposing appearance, the latter crossed his arms and looked at the new acquisition with cold eyes. He wanted to know if this was the special product they had captured that day. The carrier nodded, explaining she was a hybrid, a young woman with feline features exactly as the VIP client had requested. The girl was stretched out on the floor, her eyes wide open, her mouth covered by tape that prevented any coherent sound. Suddenly, in a desperate impulse, she managed to let out a muffled scream, demanding to be let go. The boss just watched with interest. He commented that she still had plenty of energy. Even trembling, she gathered strength to shout that she would pay any amount she had in her pockets, begging for freedom. The man laughed at the offer and sarcastically asked how much money she thought she was worth. She hurriedly replied, 2 million, which she had earned working all weekend. It was all she had. The boss's eyes widened, visibly surprised. 2 million was more than he expected from a girl like her. But soon the enthusiasm turned into contempt. He said that as much as that money was the result of effort, sweat, and sacrifice, it was still insignificant. He grabbed her hair brutally and leaned in, smiling cruelly. Compared to the 900 million they would make from her sale, and that amount was pocket change. He added that he had heard they were planning to use her in experiments. He said she shouldn't be so upset. At least she would be treated specially, unlike other hybrids who had been sold. Rixis, though weak, looked at him with tears in her eyes. He then asked with an almost casual cruelty if that wasn't better than being sent to a war camp. There were body bags scattered around her, and in her mind the idea arose that someone needed to do something to help her. The room was filled with bodies. The boss stepped away from the hostage and informed those present that only 40 minutes remained before the client's arrival. He said everything needed to be prepared and ordered them to hide those damn bags somewhere far away. The employee agreed without hesitation. Rixis then stood up abruptly and protested, claiming that everyone there knew their actions were illegal, and if discovered, the consequences would be disastrous. However, the boss only smiled sarcastically and asked what they planned to do with the hostages. Rixis believed that people thought she had committed a crime before becoming a hybrid, but that wasn't true. Still, she knew she needed to face reality. After everything her species had done to humans, this would probably be considered just sweet revenge by most. In the eyes of others, she was nothing more than a monster. Anger burned in her eyes as she internally refused to go along with it. Her body began to react, her abilities activated uncontrollably, and she understood she needed to escape even if it drove her into madness. However, suddenly she felt her abilities being blocked. Surprised, she tried to understand what was happening and why her power was failing. The employee approached and coldly explained that she was unable to use her mana. Frightened, she barely had time to react before being brutally thrown to the ground. Her face was pressed against the floor as she questioned what they had done to her. The man responded indifferently that they had injected a mana suppressor, something very effective against hybrids. He added that everyone was aware of her little games and had therefore taken all precautions. The boss then asked the employee to be gentle as the merchandise shouldn't be damaged. While coughing and moaning in pain, the employee commented that if she didn't learn to obey, she would cause even bigger problems in the future. The medicine was applied again and the boss smiled, saying he believed she had received the message. He ordered that she be taken to the hotel and warned that if she tried to cause trouble again, it should knock her out. The employee nodded silently. Suddenly, the boss began to tremble, and those around him did as well. Panic set in as they asked if something was happening above them. Supposedly, there was a special person positioned to deal with this kind of emergency. That was when the protagonist appeared beside them. With a single blow, he made the surrounding stones explode, causing a deafening crash. Entering the room, he raised a cloud of dust. The boss, frightened, shouted to know who that man was. The newcomer, identified as Yu Jai-han, declared that everyone was under arrest for illegal trafficking of foreigners and kidnapping, according to the Human Protection Act. One employee, desperate, pointed out that he was a hero, the same one who had prevented the kidnapping of a hybrid earlier. The boss, irritated, questioned why he hadn't been informed, to which the other replied that he had believed his team had handled the problem. Yu Jai-han silently observed the group. His eyes analyzed the hostages as he tried to understand the meaning of the situation. To him, the men present were clearly the main culprits. Among the hostages, he recognized the same girl from before along with several corpses. The reality was even more serious than he had imagined. Although he intended to leave the case to the police, he decided he couldn't ignore it. From now on, those individuals were monsters who needed to be eliminated. Without hesitation, he drew his weapon and prepared for confrontation. The boss, terrified, knelt and begged for mercy, saying he was just following orders. Yu Jae-han's right hand gripped his throat, and the protagonist demanded to know who the real leader behind this was. The boss refused to say the name, claiming it was better to be defeated there than to reveal such information. In his mind, it seemed absurd to think someone like Yu Jae-han actually expected an answer. After all, his men were ready to kill him. The fighters attacked from behind the protagonist, but he noticed the assault and activated his analysis skill. The stones scattered across the room began to collapse and float, creating a curtain of dust and confusion. That's how the opponents lost sight of him and started wondering where he had disappeared to. Above, Yu Jae-han appeared floating and stated he had already moved. The enemies turned their attention to him, staying alert. Yu Jae-han thought they were all hiding their presence to surprise him, which made clear they were not amateurs. Maybe they were heroes too. He spun his weapon and hit two of them at once. The others tried to stop his advance, but Yu Jae-han reacted quickly and aimed at another fighter. He realized that one was extremely fast. Over time, he managed to defeat all the combatants, leaving only the boss. The boss, in shock, began to tremble and murmured that this was impossible. He thought his men were among the strongest, even comparable to level 5 heroes. The protagonist then advanced on him and warned him not to try to escape. After some time, there were several injured scattered across the room. The employee and the boss lay on the floor, moaning in pain. Yu Jae-han freed the hostages, and as he did, one of the prisoners asked who he was. He replied that he was there to help them and said she was now free. While untying her hands, he said the police should already be on their way and asked her to tell what had happened that day. She nodded but said she would only share important information. She looked around and asked about the others. Yu Jae-han, with a sorrowful expression, replied that he was sorry, but no one else had survived. She remained silent, trembling, until she began to cry. She questioned why they were being treated that way since none of them had asked to be born. She said she didn't understand why everyone considered them monsters, and that it was deeply unfair. Yu Jae-han watched her with sadness, wanting to say something to comfort her, but no words came out. Deep down, he knew nothing he said would change that reality. At that moment, the members of the Fun Guild and the police approached the building, shouting that the guild's hero had captured the kidnappers. The police confirmed the information and ordered all units to act cautiously. Custodio stood in front of the building, showing great concern. Meanwhile, in a small cozy building, Min-Soo Lim was sitting at a table next to a companion. He said he really appreciated the time the other had taken to be there. The other smiled and replied that actually he was the one thanking him for the invitation. Min-Soo raised his small cup and, smiling, commented that the sample provided had been very useful. He said he had almost mastered the ability to control mana crystals with 100% precision. The companion confirmed, saying he had also heard about him on the news. It seemed they were drawing quite a bit of attention and the association was already watching their actions. Despite this, they still managed to operate without major difficulties. At that moment, he poured a drink into a small glass for the acquaintance. Min-Soo Lim laughed and said that of course there was nothing to worry about. He commented that if he were to be honest, he didn't want any more trouble, as there were already enough bad news that day. He raised the cup before his face and asked what he meant by that. His interlocutor asked if no one had told him anything. He explained that it seemed a minor plague was spreading through one of the factories and that the police were now investigating the entire area. The factory contained many valuable materials that could be used. Because of this, the supply had been interrupted. He said he didn't know if it was a coincidence, but the saboteur who had discovered the warehouse was the same one who had defeated the mutant saber-toothed cat. He believed this needed to be dealt with quickly and discreetly. Meanwhile, in the building where the hostages were, the protagonist took Roos outside. Min-Soo Lim took a sip of his drink and commented that he couldn't believe something of that magnitude could happen. However, he said it wasn't something she should personally worry about. After drinking, purple waves began to form on his face. Hey everyone, did you enjoy this story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.